I'd always been drawn to isolated places, the kind of locations that required hours of rough driving and careful planning just to reach. The more remote, the better. That's what made me choose landscape photography as my profession in the first place. You can't capture anything meaningful by following the crowds to overlook parking lots and paved trails. The real beauty exists in places where humanity hasn't yet left its permanent mark. When March rolled around in 2018, I saw my window. Combe Ridge would be relatively empty for another few weeks before the spring tourist season brought RVs and families with their portable speakers and Instagram poses. I wanted to capture Black Rock Arch at sunrise, lit up by that fleeting, perfect morning glow that only exists for maybe 20 minutes if you're lucky. To get that shot, I'd have to camp miles from civilization, hauling my gear into the backcountry and spending at least 2 nights alone under the stars. The solitude didn't concern me. In fact, I craved it. At 32 years old, I'd spent enough time in crowded cities, stuck in traffic, surrounded by the constant noise of modern life. The desert represented something pure to me, something honest. Out there you couldn't hide from yourself or pretend things were different than they were. The landscape demanded truth. Combe Ridge itself was spectacular, a massive upthrust of Navajo sandstone slicing through Utah's southeastern landscape like a petrified wave frozen mid-crest. The formation stretched for nearly 80 miles, a geological wonder that had witnessed millennia pass in silence. Getting there wasn't easy, but the Bureau of Land Management maintained primitive campsites scattered near the ridge, accessible via a rough gravel road that wound through juniper forests and across dry washes. I'd studied the maps for weeks, choosing the furthest campsite, the one that promised true isolation. No neighboring sites within miles, no through traffic, nothing between me and the vast expanse of high desert sky. Perfect for photography, perfect for the kind of deep silence I needed. I turned off US Route 163 late in the afternoon, my truck bouncing and rocking as the tires rolled over washboard ruts and loose stones. The suspension creaked with each impact. Junipers blurred past in dark green streaks, their twisted trunks casting long shadows across the road. The canyon walls glowed orange in the dropping sun, layers of ancient sediment painted in shades of rust and amber. 40 minutes of slow, careful driving brought me to the campsite. My headlights cut through the fading light, illuminating a small clearing tucked near the mouth of a dry wash. Combe Ridge loomed behind, its massive sandstone face catching the last rays of sunlight. The spot was exactly as I'd hoped, empty, quiet, and beautifully remote. After setting up my tent, I sat by the small fire ring someone had constructed from desert stones, heating water for dinner on my portable stove. The dehydrated meal tasted like cardboard, but I barely noticed. Above me, the night sky deepened through shades of violet and indigo, and then stars began to emerge. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, until the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. The world around me was utterly silent, except for the soft hiss of my stove, and somewhere far off in the distance, the faint chorus of coyotes singing to each other across the empty miles. Their voices rose and fell in eerie harmonies that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. I felt completely alone and completely at peace, exactly what I'd been seeking. Around midnight, I crawled into my sleeping bag and switched off my headlamp. Darkness flooded in immediately, absolute and total. This far from any light pollution, night meant true blackness, the kind that makes you understand why our ancestors feared the dark. But I'd camped alone dozens of times. The darkness didn't bother me. If anything, I found it comforting, like being wrapped in a heavy blanket. Sleep came quickly. I drifted off, listening to the wind moving through the junipers, a gentle rustling that sounded almost like breathing. I don't know what woke me. At first, I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, eyes open but seeing nothing in the pitch-black interior of my tent. My heart was already beating faster, some primal part of my brain registering danger before my conscious mind caught up. I listened intently, trying to identify what had pulled me from sleep. Silence. Complete silence. Even the wind had stopped. Then I heard it, the soft crunch of gravel, faint but distinct, like careful footsteps circling the perimeter of my campsite. My pulse quickened, thudding heavily in my ears. I held my breath, straining to hear better. The sound came again. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the outside of my tent in a wide circle. Wildlife, I told myself. A deer or maybe a stray cow wandering through. The BLM land was open range, and cattle sometimes roamed through these remote areas. That would explain the cautious steps, the hesitation. Animals moved carefully at night, testing each footfall. But the longer I listened, the less certain I became. The pattern was too regular, too purposeful. Animals wandered erratically, following scents or sounds, zigzagging as they explored. These footsteps maintained a steady rhythm, circling my campsite in what seemed like a deliberate perimeter. I reached for my headlamp with a trembling hand and unzipped the tent flap as quietly as I could. The zipper seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Peering out into the night, I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the darkness beyond the reach of my light. A light breeze had picked up, rustling through the junipers. The beam of my headlamp swept across the campsite, illuminating my truck, my gear, the fire ring. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. No animals, no movement, no explanation for the sounds that had woken me. "Hello," I called out softly, immediately feeling foolish. My voice seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, swallowed up before it could travel more than a few feet. No response, just the wind and the creaking of juniper branches. I stepped out of my tent fully, my bare feet sinking into the cold sand. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and I shivered in my t-shirt and boxers. Shining my headlamp in a slow circle around the campsite, I searched for tracks, for any sign of what might have been walking around my tent. The sand was mostly undisturbed. I could see my own footprints from earlier, leading from my truck to the tent to the fire ring, but nothing else. No deer tracks, no cow prints, nothing that would explain what I'd heard. The feeling of being watched pressed down on me, a physical sensation like invisible eyes tracking my every movement. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt very exposed, very vulnerable, standing alone in the darkness miles from another human being. I retreated to my tent, zipping the flap tight and pulling my sleeping bag up to my chin. My hand found the knife I always kept in my gear bag, and I placed it beside my pillow. The cold metal was oddly comforting. It took a long time for sleep to return. I lay there listening, every nerve on high alert, jumping at the slightest sound. Eventually, exhaustion won out over vigilance, and I drifted into restless, dream-filled sleep. Morning light filtering through the tent fabric woke me. I lay still for a moment, groggy and disoriented, then remembered the previous night. The memory seemed less frightening in daylight, probably just my imagination running wild in the isolation, I told myself. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, stretching my stiff muscles. The desert morning was beautiful, the air crisp and clean, the sky a perfect unmarked blue. Then I looked around my campsite and froze. The firewood I had stacked neatly beside the fire ring was scattered across the clearing, pieces tossed several feet in different directions. My water bottles, which I'd left lined up beside my truck, were knocked over, and my tent flap, which I distinctly remembered zipping completely closed when I went back inside, was now halfway open, the zipper pulled down nearly to the bottom. I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Wind could have knocked over the water bottles, I supposed, though they were heavy 5-gallon containers that shouldn't have toppled easily. But wind didn't scatter firewood in multiple directions, and it certainly didn't unzip tents. Unease settled deep in my chest, cold and heavy. I walked slowly around the campsite, examining everything carefully. My gear appeared otherwise untouched. My camera equipment was secure in my truck. Nothing was missing or obviously disturbed beyond the firewood and water bottles. I knelt down, studying the sand around my tent more carefully in the daylight. My own footprints were clear, along with something else, parallel drag marks, as if something had been pulled across the sand. The marks led from my tent toward the wash, then disappeared into the rocky ground. My hands shook slightly as I made coffee on my camp stove, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe an animal had investigated the campsite, knocking things around. The tent zipper could have been partially open all along, and I simply misremembered closing it fully. The drag marks could be from when I'd pulled my gear bag across the sand the previous day. But even as I constructed these explanations, I didn't believe them. Something had been here during the night. Something had been in my campsite, moving through my things while I slept mere feet away. I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on why I'd come here, the photography. I hiked out toward Black Rock Arc, camera gear weighing heavily on my back, studying the light and planning my shots. The physical activity helped calm my nerves. In the daylight, surrounded by the stunning beauty of the sandstone formations, my fears seemed overblown. By late afternoon, I was positioned on a ledge overlooking the sweeping expanse of Combe Ridge, capturing the play of light and shadow across the layered stone. Through the viewfinder, the world narrowed down to composition and exposure, manageable and comprehensible. Behind the camera, I felt in control again. As the sun began its descent behind the ridge, I lowered my camera and allowed myself to simply observe the landscape. The scale of it was overwhelming. These formations had existed for hundreds of millions of years, would continue existing long after I was gone. Human concerns seemed trivial against that timescale. Then a sharp crack echoed up from somewhere below the ledge, the sound of a stone dislodging and tumbling down the steep slope. I leaned forward carefully, peering down into the ravine beneath my position. Nothing moved among the jumbled rocks and sparse vegetation, but the sound had been unmistakable. Something had disturbed the loose stones down there. I stood perfectly still, listening, my heart rate picking up. Minutes passed. The shadows lengthened across the canyon floor. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been natural rockfall, the kind that happens constantly in these erosion-carved landscapes. But as I began packing up my gear, anxious to return to camp before full darkness, I noticed something that made me stop cold. There, clearly pressed into a patch of sandy dirt on the trail ahead, was a single boot print. I knelt down, studying it with growing dread. The print was unmistakably from my hiking boots. I recognized the distinctive zigzag tread pattern of my Merrill Moabs, but it was facing the wrong direction, pointing up the trail toward my current position rather than down toward camp where I'd hiked from. My mind spun, desperate for a logical explanation. Maybe I'd turned around at some point, stepped backward while adjusting my camera settings. But examining the surrounding area, I found no other prints nearby, just this single track, impossibly isolated, pointing toward me like an accusation. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as a terrible thought occurred to me. What if someone had been following me today, stepping carefully in my exact footprints, matching my stride so perfectly that I wouldn't notice extra tracks? What if they'd slipped only once, placing their foot down slightly ahead of where I'd stepped, creating this single backward-facing print? I looked around quickly, scanning the rocks and shadows, suddenly certain I was being watched. But the landscape remained empty and still, offering no answers. My hands trembled as I hurriedly shouldered my camera bag and started back toward camp, walking much faster than I normally would on the rocky trail, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. By the time I reached my campsite, twilight had drained most of the color from the world, leaving everything in shades of gray. I built a fire quickly, needing the light and warmth, trying to push down the fear that kept rising in my throat. As full darkness settled in, I became hyper-aware of every sound, the pop and crack of burning wood, the rustle of wind through brush, the distant call of a nightbird. I kept my headlamp on, sweeping its beam around the perimeter of my campsite every few minutes, searching for anything out of place. The hours crawled by. I didn't want to go to sleep, didn't want to be vulnerable and unconscious when whatever was out there decided to come closer. But exhaustion eventually won. Around midnight, I retreated to my tent, keeping my boots just outside the flap where I could quickly slip them on if needed. I lay in my sleeping bag fully clothed, knife in hand, staring at the dark fabric of the tent ceiling. Sleep felt impossible. My body was tense, ready to move at the slightest provocation. Just after 1:30 in the morning, according to my watch's glowing display, I heard the footsteps return. This time there was no mistaking what I was hearing. Slow, deliberate steps in the gravel, approaching my tent from the direction of the wash. Each footfall was distinct and intentional, nothing like the random movements of an animal. The steps came closer. Closer, then stopped directly behind where my head rested against my pillow, only the thin nylon of the tent wall between me and whatever stood outside. Fear paralyzed me completely. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My heart hammered so hard I worried it might burst. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't make my muscles respond. Then I heard it, a long, deep breath, like someone exhaling after holding their breath for a long time. The sound was wrong somehow, too wet, too raspy, lasting several seconds longer than any normal breath should. It ended in a rattling wheeze that made every hair on my body stand on end. Whatever was out there was breathing, standing inches from my head, separated only by fabric, breathing. "Who's there?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking with terror. No response, just another one of those awful too long breaths. Some desperate courage surged through me, breaking the paralysis. I lunged forward and tore open the tent flap, shining my headlamp out into the darkness with shaking hands. The beam swept across empty space, illuminating nothing but sand and rocks and the dark shapes of junipers. Nothing was there. But when I looked down at where I'd left my boots, my stomach dropped. One of them was gone. The left boot had vanished, leaving only the right one sitting alone in the dirt where I'd placed them both. I stared at the single remaining boot, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This wasn't wind. This wasn't an animal. Something had taken my boot while I'd been frozen in terror just seconds earlier, had been standing right here, had been the source of that terrible breathing. I grabbed the remaining boot and retreated into my tent, zipping the flap with trembling fingers. I pulled my sleeping bag over my head like a child hiding from monsters, knowing it offered no real protection but unable to think of anything else to do. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. Morning brought no relief, only exhaustion and jangled nerves. I'd barely slept, jerking awake at every small sound, my hand clutching the knife until my fingers cramped. When pale light finally began to show through the tent fabric, I emerged feeling hollow and strung out. The desert morning should have been beautiful, but I could barely appreciate it. Everything felt muted somehow, the colors less vibrant, the air less fresh. The missing boot lay just where I'd seen it last night, or rather where it wasn't. The empty space seemed to mock me. I considered packing up and leaving right then. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to get in my truck and drive away from this place as fast as possible. But stubbornness kept me rooted. I'd come here for a specific shot, had planned this trip for months. I wasn't going to let fear chase me away, not yet. I found my old trail runners behind the seat of my truck, a backup pair I'd forgotten about. They were worn thin, barely adequate for the rough terrain, but better than going barefoot. I laced them up tightly and tried to ignore how wrong they felt, how vulnerable. All morning the desert felt different, off. The usual sounds were absent, no birdsong, no insects buzzing, no distant coyote calls. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. Even the wind seemed hesitant, barely stirring the branches. I forced myself to hike out toward Black Rock Arch around noon, moving slower than usual, feeling heavy and drained. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every distant rock formation looked like it might be a figure watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the certainty that I was being observed. The arch itself was magnificent, a graceful curve of ancient stone spanning a gap in the cliff face, worn smooth by countless millennia of wind and water. Under different circumstances, I would have been thrilled to photograph it, but today I worked mechanically, going through the motions without any real connection to what I was doing. The shadows lengthened as afternoon wore into evening. I'd spent too long at the arch, lost in my own fearful thoughts, and now I'd have to hurry to make it back to camp before darkness fell. I packed my gear quickly and started back, nearly jogging on the rougher sections of trail. The thin-soled trail runners provided little protection against the sharp rocks and thorny vegetation. By the time my campsite came into view, silhouetted against the deepening violet sky, my feet were sore and bleeding, but relief flooded through me at reaching relative safety. Then I saw it, and the relief turned to ice in my veins. Both of my boots were gone now. I'd left the right boot outside my tent this morning, hoping maybe the missing left boot would reappear. Some part of me still clinging to rational explanations. Both boots had vanished. I spun around, suddenly aware of movement at the edge of my vision. Something was emerging from the shadows near the wash, stepping into the dying light with slow, careful movements. A figure, human-shaped, walking toward me with measured steps. I squinted through the twilight, my eyes struggling to focus. As it came closer, stepping into the last rays of sunlight, I felt my sanity begin to fracture. It was wearing my boots, my hiking pants, my flannel shirt, my watch on its left wrist, my ball cap pulled low over its face. The figure moved strangely, limbs swinging in a way that wasn't quite right, joints bending at slightly wrong angles. Its gait was stiff and uneven, each step requiring visible effort and concentration, like someone learning to walk for the first time. It came closer, 15 feet away now, then 10. I could see its face clearly now in the fading light, and my chest constricted with horror so pure and absolute that I couldn't draw breath. The face was mine. Not exactly. The proportions were subtly wrong. Cheekbones too sharp, jaw too angular, forehead too high. The eyes were sunken deep in their sockets, reflecting no light, just empty dark holes in a too pale face. But the overall structure, the features were unmistakably mine, like looking at a distorted reflection in a warped mirror. "What?" I managed to whisper, the word dying in my throat. At the sound of my voice, the thing jerked forward, a single unnatural lurch that covered 3 feet in one movement. Its head tilted to the side, studying me with those hollow eyes, and I realized it was mimicking me, learning me, trying to copy not just my appearance, but my movements, my mannerisms, my essential self. It took another step. The wrong face with my features smiled slightly, lips pulling back to reveal teeth that were just a bit too long, too white, too many. Every instinct in my body screamed a single word: run. And suddenly I was running, sprinting barefoot into the gathering darkness, leaving behind my tent, my truck, my gear, my entire life. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. The thought of seeing that thing, that broken copy of myself, standing silent in my campsite watching me flee, was more than I could bear. I ran blindly through the desert night, my thin-soled runners providing almost no protection against the sharp rocks and thorns that tore at my feet. Pain shot through my legs with each impact, but terror propelled me forward, drowning out everything else. Branches whipped at my face and caught at my clothes. I stumbled over unseen obstacles, falling hard twice, scrambling back up without pause. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning, but I didn't slow down. The rational part of my brain had completely shut down, leaving only animal panic. I had no plan, no destination, just an overwhelming need to get away from that clearing, from that terrible imitation of myself standing in my stolen clothes. Time became meaningless. I might have run for 20 minutes or 2 hours. I had no way of knowing. The darkness was total, the moon not yet risen, and I navigated purely by instinct, stumbling through the brush toward where I thought the main road might be. Finally, my legs simply gave out. I collapsed in a heap, gasping for air, my entire body shaking with exhaustion and shock. For several minutes, I just lay there, too spent to move, staring up at the stars that wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Slowly, my thinking brain began to function again. I was lost, alone, miles from help, with nothing. No water, no shelter, no way to call for assistance. My phone was back at camp, along with everything else. If I didn't find the road, I could easily die out here from exposure or dehydration. I forced myself to stand on trembling legs. The desert night was cold, and I was already shivering in my sweat-soaked shirt. I had to keep moving, had to find my way out. I walked through the darkness for what felt like hours, heading generally east toward where I hoped the gravel road would be. The stars provided some navigation, and gradually my eyes adjusted enough to make out the darker shapes of trees and rocks against the slightly lighter sky. As the night slowly gave way to gray pre-dawn light, I heard the most beautiful sound I'd ever experienced, the low rumble of an engine in the distance. Hope surged painfully in my chest, and I stumbled toward the sound, pushing through a final stand of junipers onto the washboard surface of the gravel road. A dusty red Jeep Wrangler came around the bend, its headlights cutting through the morning mist. I stood in the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically, and the vehicle slowed immediately. The driver was a man in his 60s with deeply weathered skin and kind eyes that widened with alarm as he took in my appearance, scratched, bloodied, barefoot, and clearly in distress. "My godson, what happened to you?" he asked, already climbing out of his Jeep. "Please," I gasped, my voice hoarse. "I need help. Something. There was something at my campsite." He guided me gently to the passenger seat, and I collapsed into it, shaking uncontrollably. As we drove, I told him everything in fragmented bursts: the footsteps, the stolen boots, the thing that had worn my face. He listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled but never disbelieving. We drove directly to the BLM station just outside Bluff, where a ranger listened to my story with increasing concern. Despite my obvious exhaustion and trauma, I insisted we return to my campsite immediately. I needed to know what had happened, needed some kind of closure or explanation, needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. It was mid-morning when we arrived back at the clearing where I'd camped. The ranger got out first, his hand resting on the pepper spray at his belt, scanning the area cautiously before allowing me to follow. The campsite was completely empty, not just abandoned empty, as if I'd never been there at all. My tent was gone, my sleeping bag, my stove, my fire ring, even the scattered firewood, all vanished without a trace. The ground was smooth and undisturbed, no tire tracks from my truck, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever camped here. Then I saw them, and my blood turned to ice despite the rising heat of the day. My boots sat side by side in the exact center of where my fire ring had been, laces tied in perfect bows, positioned as precisely as if someone had used a measuring tape to place them. They looked new, perfectly clean despite everything they'd been through. The ranger stared at them, his weathered face pale. "Come on," he said quietly after a long moment. "We shouldn't stay here." As we walked back to his truck, he spoke in a low voice, as if afraid of being overheard. "The locals don't talk much about this area, bad history. But sometimes hikers or campers come down to the station shaken up, telling stories about things they've seen or experienced out here. Figures that look human but move wrong, voices calling from empty canyons, things going missing and then turning up in impossible places." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are old stories, legends, things the Navajo people know about but don't share with outsiders. Shapeshifters, beings that can take on the appearance of animals or people, but never quite get it right." I said nothing, just stared out the window at the passing landscape, my mind trying and failing to process what had happened to me. On the drive back to Bluff, I made a decision. I would never return to Comb Ridge, would never speak of this to anyone who might think I was crazy, would try somehow to move forward and forget. Later, sitting alone in a cheap motel room, I went through my camera's memory card. The photos from Comb Ridge were beautiful, technically perfect, capturing the landscape in all its stark beauty. But looking at them made me feel sick and cold. I deleted every single image, then reformatted the card twice to be sure they were truly gone. I couldn't keep them, couldn't risk looking at them later and seeing something in the background, some figure watching from the shadows that I hadn't noticed when I'd taken the shot. The ranger's words stayed with me long after I'd left Utah and returned to my normal life. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw my boots sitting in that empty clearing, perfectly placed, impossibly clean. A message from something that had studied me, copied me, worn my skin like clothing. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's still out there, still wearing my face, still walking the desert in my stolen boots, perfecting its imitation, waiting for the next photographer or hiker seeking solitude in the vast emptiness of Comb Ridge. I never went back to landscape photography after that. Some places I learned are empty for a reason, and some types of solitude are far more dangerous than any crowd. I spent 30 years reading the stories people left behind in the dirt, and the job had left its own story on me. Most of that time was with Border Patrol's Bartak, working the harsh corridors of the Southwest, where the tales were always grim. I learned to read the earth like a book. Every footprint, every broken twig, every disturbed grain of sand held meaning. But the ghosts of those stories, traffickers, cartels, the desperate and the dead, had hollowed me out from the inside. When I retired at 52, I bought a small camper with my pension money, took my aging Belgian Malinois mix, Boone, and went looking for silence. The small jobs I took, finding lost hikers, tracking stray livestock, were supposed to be simple, honest work. No more midnight raids, no more bodies in the desert, no more reading the final moments of someone's life in the pattern of their last struggle. The morning air in the Cibola National Forest was crisp, carrying the scent of pinon and cold stone. October in northern New Mexico had a particular quality, thin air that made sounds carry strangely, shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. I was sipping coffee from a tin mug while Boone lay stretched in a patch of weak sunlight, his gray muzzle twitching occasionally as he dreamed. That's when I heard the engine, a heavy-duty diesel pulling off the fire road. The sound was wrong for this early hour, wrong for this remote spot I'd chosen specifically for its isolation. My hand moved instinctively toward the Glock on my hip, old habits refusing to die. The man who stepped out of the dust-caked F-350 looked like he'd been carved from the land itself. Skin like cured leather stretched over a frame that had been powerful once, but now carried the careful movements of age and hard use. His eyes were the color of dried mud, and they never stopped moving, scanning my setup, cataloging exits, reading me the same way I was reading him. "Name Silas Webb," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of too many cigarettes and too much wind. "Got a ranch bordering the Zuni Mountains. Heard you're the man who finds things that don't want to be found." Webb's ranch sprawled across a valley that looked like God had taken a massive bite out of the earth. The land was beautiful in the way broken things can be beautiful. Scarred mesas rising like ancient monuments, arroyos cutting through the earth like claw marks. His operation was substantial, maybe 800 head of Hereford cattle scattered across 10,000 acres of juniper scrub and bunchgrass. "Started losing them 8 weeks ago," Webb explained as we stood on his porch. The house was old, built from massive pine logs that had darkened to almost black over the generations. Not a whole herd, one at a time, 8 heads so far. I asked the usual questions while Boone investigated the yard, his trained nose cataloging new scents. "Fences? Check them daily. No breaks, no cuts." "Rustlers don't work that way," I said. "They take a truckload and leave tracks." "What about predators?" Webb's jaw tightened. "A cougar kill is a mess. Drag marks, blood everywhere. Coyotes leave even more of a scene. These," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "they just vanish. No sign of struggle, no blood. They're there at sunset, gone by morning." The absence of ranch dogs struck me immediately. A working ranch without dogs was like a church without a bell. When I mentioned it, Webb's weathered face seemed to age another decade. "Had a couple. Good working dogs, been with me for years. They got spooked about 3 weeks back. Started whining at night, wouldn't go near the north pasture. Then one morning they were just gone." He was offering good money, more than the job warranted. But it wasn't the money that made me take it. It was the puzzle. In 3 decades of tracking, I'd learned one absolute truth. There was always a trace, always a story written in the earth. Nothing simply vanished. I started where the last heifer had been seen, a section of pasture that butted up against a nameless canyon cutting into the Zuni Range. For hours, Boone and I walked a slow grid pattern. I found the mundane tracks of the remaining herd, the delicate prints of pronghorn, the padding marks of coyotes keeping their distance. Then Boone stopped. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. Instead, a sound emerged from deep in his chest, a low, vibrating whine. I'd only heard once before, when we'd stumbled upon a mass grave in the Sonoran Desert. His entire body had gone rigid, every muscle locked in primal tension. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, his tail tucked so tight against his belly it disappeared. I knelt beside him, my hand finding the trembling muscles along his spine. I followed his fixed gaze to a flat piece of sandstone 20 feet away. There, almost invisible against the red rock, was a single stain the color of old rust. A few feet from it, snagged on the flesh-hungry thorns of a cholla cactus, hung a tuft of red Hereford fir. The trail was faint, a scuff here, a partial print there, leading away from the open pasture toward the canyon mouth. Each step deeper felt like descending into still water. The normal sounds of the high desert, the whisper of wind through juniper, the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk faded until only our footsteps remained. The canyon walls rose on either side, red rock stained with long vertical streaks of desert varnish that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the shade. Boone pressed against my leg as we walked, a constant trembling presence. We found the rib cage in a circular clearing where the canyon briefly widened. It sat in the exact center, positioned with deliberate care. The bones were picked clean with surgical precision, no shreds of meat, no sinew, no cartilage. They gleamed white in the filtered sunlight like a museum specimen. I circled the remains slowly, reading the ground. In a patch of damp sand fed by a seep in the canyon wall, I found the tracks that changed everything. The story was written clearly in that damp sand, and what it told made my mouth go dry. I saw the distinct cloven hoofprints of the heifer, deep and panicked. Alongside them was another set of tracks that defied explanation. They started as large canine prints, bigger than any wolf, bigger than any dog. But as I followed them, something impossible happened. The pattern changed. The stride lengthened from 4 feet to 6 feet to 8 feet. The pad marks elongated. The claw marks gradually receded and disappeared. Within 10 yards, the tracks had transformed completely. They were now unmistakably the prints of a large, barefoot human. I stood slowly, my knees protesting, a sensation like ice water flooding my veins. My hand found Boone's head, seeking comfort in his familiar warmth. Every instinct honed by decades of tracking dangerous men screamed at me to leave, now, but my professional pride, the part of me that had never met a trail I couldn't follow, wouldn't let me walk away. I made the decision to camp here, to see what the full darkness would reveal. It was the kind of mistake that experience should have taught me not to make, but I was a man who had spent his life tracking human monsters. I had forgotten there might be other kinds. I backed the truck up to the edge of the clearing, positioning the camper so the door faced the canyon mouth, the only approach I could watch. I built a small fire of dry juniper, more for the psychological comfort than warmth. The sun dropped behind the mesa, and the canyon filled with shadows that seemed to have weight and substance. Boone refused his dinner. He wouldn't even take water from my hand. Instead, he crawled into his travel crate in the camper and curled into the smallest ball possible. I could hear the steady vibration of his trembling through the thin aluminum floor. Night fell like a black curtain dropping. The darkness in the canyon was absolute. No stars penetrated the narrow strip of sky above. No moon. Just an oppressive black that pressed against my eyes, and with it came silence. Not the natural quiet of the desert night, but a complete absence of sound that felt manufactured. No insects, no rustle of nocturnal creatures, no whisper of wind. It was the dead, sterile silence of a soundproof room. I sat in my camp chair for hours, cradling the Mossberg loaded with double-aught buckshot, my eyes trying to pierce the impenetrable dark. I saw nothing, heard nothing, but I felt something, a presence, an attention focused on me with the intensity of a predator studying prey. Around midnight, the cold finally drove me inside. I locked the camper's flimsy door, knowing it was a meaningless gesture, but needing the illusion of barrier. I lay on the narrow bunk fully clothed, boots still laced, the shotgun across my chest. That's when it began. The sound started at the rear of the camper, not the frantic scratching of a bear investigating a new smell, but something deliberate, methodical. It was a single hard point, like a sharpened piece of flint, or an elongated claw being dragged with immense pressure along the aluminum skin. The sound was excruciating, a high-pitched metallic shriek that vibrated through the floor, through the bunk, through my bones. The scraping moved with agonizing slowness, past the rear window, along the side where my bunk was positioned. I could track its progress by sound alone, imagining something tall enough to reach the roof, something taking its time, something that wanted me to hear every second of its passage. Boone had gone completely silent in his crate. That silence terrified me more than any sound he could have made. In 30 years of partnership through gunfights and drug raids and midnight pursuits, I had never known him to go quiet in the face of danger. He always met threat with aggression. This silence spoke of something beyond threat, something that triggered instincts older than domestication. The scraping stopped directly outside the door. I held my breath, the shotgun safety off, my finger resting on the trigger guard. I waited for the handle to rattle, for the lock to break, for whatever was outside to try to come in. Nothing happened, just the return of that crushing, absolute silence. I remained frozen on that bunk for the rest of the night, every muscle locked, barely breathing. I watched the window for any hint of dawn with the desperation of a man watching for rescue. When the first weak gray light finally filtered through, I waited another hour before moving, some primitive part of my brain insisting on full daylight. When I finally unlatched the door and stepped outside, Boone refused to follow. He remained huddled in the back of his crate, a low continuous whine emanating from his throat, the sound of an animal pushed beyond its ability to cope. The mark on the camper stopped me cold. A single gouge ran the entire length of the vehicle, perfectly straight, carved deep enough to reveal the insulation beneath. It started exactly at the rear corner and ended precisely at the front edge, not an inch of deviation. Whatever had made it possessed not just strength but control, precision, intelligence. But that wasn't what made me stumble backward, my breakfast coffee rising in my throat. In the clearing where my camp chair had sat, a new arrangement had appeared. Bones not from the cow but from smaller animals had been laid out in an intricate pattern. Rabbit bones, coyote skulls, what might have been deer vertebrae. Every single bone had been snapped cleanly in half with surgical precision. They were arranged in a tight spiral on the dusty ground, each piece positioned with mathematical accuracy. This wasn't the remains of a kill. This wasn't the cache of a predator. This was art. This was communication. This was a message delivered with cold, calculating intelligence. I was here. I watched you. I could have entered any time I wished. This is what I can do. You are alive because I allow it. I moved with desperate, shaking hands, kicking dirt over the bone spiral. Not to hide it, but because I couldn't bear to look at it any longer. My hands trembled so badly it took 3 attempts to properly hitch the camper. Boone saw his chance and leaped from the crate to the truck's cab before I had the passenger door fully open. He scrambled to the far corner of the bench seat and pressed himself against the door, his wide, terrified eyes fixed on the canyon mouth. I didn't bother with the rough track. I slammed the truck into gear and crashed straight through the scrub brush, the camper lurching violently behind me. I didn't look in the mirrors. I could feel the weight of observation on my back, the sensation of being allowed to leave rather than escaping. The truck's engine stayed running as I skidded to a stop in front of Webb's ranch house. Dust clouded around the vehicle as I left the driver's door hanging open. Webb emerged onto the porch and I saw it, a flicker of hope in his eyes that died the instant he saw my face. I walked up the steps on unsteady legs and pulled the wad of cash from my pocket. I placed his deposit on the porch railing between us. "Job's off," I said, my voice flat and strange to my own ears. "What did you find?" Webb asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Did you find what took them?" My eyes moved past him to the heavy wooden door of his house, and there, carved into the dark wood of the lintel above the doorframe, I saw it. A small faded symbol, worn smooth by generations of hands passing beneath it. An intricate spiral identical to the one made from broken bones in the clearing. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. The spooked dogs that had run off. The cattle that vanished without trace. The amount of money he'd offered, not payment for a job, but the price of a life. "I found what you wanted me to find," I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "A rib cage picked clean. Tracks that start with 4 legs and end with 2. I found the thing you've been leaving offerings for." The facade crumbled from Webb's face like old plaster. All the careful tension, the worried rancher act, collapsed into something much older and more terrible. He looked past me toward the dark line of the Zuni Mountains, and I saw the weight of generations in his eyes. "It's been here forever," he said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "My great-grandfather, he made an arrangement. We leave it be, pay a tithe, and it leaves the family alone. Cattle, mostly. Sometimes deer we'd shoot and leave out there." He swallowed hard, his throat working like he was trying to swallow broken glass. "But the last few years, the tithe wasn't enough. It wanted more, started coming closer, started leaving messages." I stared at Webb, the full, sickening truth settling in my gut like lead. He hadn't been hiring an investigator. He had been shopping for a sacrifice. A stranger with no local connections, someone whose disappearance would raise no questions. He was hoping to put a new piece on the board, to give whatever lurked in those canyons a new toy to occupy its attention. "You didn't lose those cows," I said, each word falling like a stone. "You fed them to something that's been watching your family for 4 generations, and when that wasn't enough, you tried to feed it me." He didn't deny it, couldn't. He just lowered his head, a man utterly broken by his inheritance. "You don't understand," he whispered. "The things it's done when the compact was broken. My grandmother tried to leave once, tried to sell the ranch. They found pieces of her scattered across 3 counties. I turned without another word and walked back to my truck. I left the money on the railing, blood money I wouldn't touch." The engine roared to life, and I drove away from that cursed ranch, away from Webb and his terrible inheritance. The sensation of being watched followed me for miles. It sat heavy on my shoulders, a physical pressure that made breathing difficult. Only when my tires hit the pavement of Highway 53 did it finally release its grip. I pointed the truck east and pressed the accelerator to the floor, not stopping until the lights of Albuquerque spread before me like a glittering promise of anonymity. The next morning, I found the first RV dealership I could. When the salesman started his pitch, I cut him off. "I'll take whatever cash you'll give me for it. Today." An hour later, I drove out with a check and an empty hitch. I knew I would never sleep in a thin-walled trailer again. That night, in a concrete motel room with 3 locks on the door, I finally felt something approaching safe. Boone slept deeply for the first time in days, occasionally whimpering in his dreams. I thought about reporting it, but what would I say? What proof did I have except a scratch on aluminum and the testimony of a dog's terror? Webb would continue his family's horrific tradition, and that thing in the mountains would continue its patient hunt. But we had escaped. We had looked into something ancient and wrong, and lived to drive away. In a world full of monsters, human and otherwise, sometimes survival is the only victory that matters. I never took another tracking job. These days I work security at a warehouse in the city, surrounded by concrete and steel and the comforting press of humanity. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows from the west, I think I can smell pinyon and cold stone. On those nights, Boone still whines in his sleep, and I stay awake until dawn, listening for the sound of something sharp and deliberate scraping against the walls. I'm not exactly sure what me and a few friends experienced fully that October weekend in 2019, but there was definitely something deeply unsettling about our encounter. Something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it too long. This story takes place during the fall of 2019, when I was 17 years old. Our Boy Scout troop had planned a cabin campout at a remote location deep in the pine forests of northern Michigan, far from any main roads or cell phone towers. The moment our convoy of vehicles pulled up to the weathered log cabin, I felt an odd sensation settle in my stomach. The structure looked like it had been abandoned for months, with peeling paint on the shutters and a sagging front porch that groaned under the weight of fallen branches. The surrounding woods pressed in close on all sides, creating a claustrophobic feeling that made the clearing feel smaller than it actually was. Ancient pine trees towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the late afternoon sunlight, casting everything in an eerie twilight, even though it was only 4 o'clock. Our troop leader, Mr. Rodriguez, a gruff man in his 50s with calloused hands and permanent stubble, gathered us around as we unloaded our gear from the trailers. "Listen up, boys," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "This place is pretty isolated, so stick to the main paths and don't wander off alone. The nearest ranger station is 20 miles away, and cell service is non-existent out here." As we hauled our duffel bags and sleeping bags toward the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Every few steps, I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the tree line, searching for movement among the shadows. The other scouts seemed excited about our wilderness adventure, chattering loudly about the games they'd brought and the s'mores we'd make later, but their voices sounded muted and strange in the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. Inside the cabin, the musty smell of old wood and damp fabric hit us immediately. The main room featured a stone fireplace blackened with years of use, and mounted deer heads stared down at us with glassy eyes that seemed to follow our movements. My friend Camden and I claimed a small bedroom near the back of the cabin, close to one of the few electrical outlets available. The room felt cramped with its low ceiling and single grimy window that looked out into the darkening woods. As we unpacked our belongings, Camden pulled out his phone and frowned at the screen. "No signal at all," he muttered, holding it up toward the window. "Not even one bar." The isolation suddenly felt more real, more complete. We were truly cut off from the outside world, surrounded by miles of empty forest with no way to call for help if something went wrong. The first evening passed without major incident, though I found myself constantly aware of the sounds outside our windows. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense up, and I noticed several other scouts glancing nervously toward the doors whenever the wind picked up. We played cards by lamplight and roasted hot dogs over the fireplace, but underneath the forced normalcy, there was an undercurrent of unease that none of us wanted to acknowledge out loud. The next morning brought a thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke, reducing visibility to just a few yards in any direction. When I stepped outside to use the primitive outhouse behind the cabin, the mist swirled around my legs and made the familiar landscape look alien and threatening. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, nothing but the soft whisper of my footsteps on the damp pine needles. We spent most of the morning inside the cabin, playing card games and taking turns on the GameCube that one of the younger scouts had brought along. Someone had also packed a portable projector, which we set up in the main room to play movies on a white sheet hung across one wall. The artificial entertainment helped distract us from the oppressive atmosphere outside, but every so often, one of us would glance toward the windows, where the fog pressed against the glass like searching fingers. Camden and I had become close friends over the past 2 years in scouting, bonding over our shared love of horror movies and video games. He was smaller than me, with sandy hair and quick reflexes, while I had always been the biggest kid in our group, a fact that usually meant I got stuck with the heavy lifting. Today was no exception when Mr. Rodriguez announced that we were running low on drinking water. "The pump house is about a mile down the main trail," he explained, pointing through the window toward a barely visible path that disappeared into the fog. "Someone needs to take these 5-gallon jugs down there and fill them up." He gestured toward 3 large plastic containers stacked near the door. "It's not a difficult walk, but those jugs will be heavy when they're full." I volunteered immediately, partly out of a sense of duty and partly because I was getting restless cooped up inside. Camden offered to come with me, along with 2 other scouts, Ryan, a quiet kid with thick glasses, and Brandon, who was known for his nervous laugh and tendency to jump at shadows. The 4 of us loaded the empty jugs into backpacks and prepared to venture out into the fog. As we stepped off the cabin's front porch, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The fog muffled all sound, creating a bubble of silence that moved with us as we walked. Our footsteps on the pine needle path sounded unnaturally loud, and I found myself walking more quietly without consciously deciding to do so. The trail was well marked with small wooden posts, but the limited visibility made it feel like we were walking through an endless gray void. About halfway to our destination, we discovered something that would prove crucial later that night. Beside the trail, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, sat an old wooden cart with 2 large wheels and a long handle. It looked like something a groundskeeper might use to haul tools or supplies around the property. The wood was weathered and gray, but the cart appeared sturdy enough to handle some weight. "This could save us a lot of effort," I said, testing the handle. The cart rolled smoothly despite its age, and I realized it would be perfect for transporting the heavy water jugs back to the cabin. We made a mental note of its location and continued toward the pump house. The pump house materialized out of the fog like something from a fever dream. It was a small concrete block building with a single yellow light fixture mounted above a heavy metal door. Next to it stood a more modern structure that appeared to be a shower facility for campers, complete with exterior spigots and an electrical meter that hummed quietly in the damp air. Between the 2 buildings, an old-fashioned hand pump extended from a concrete pad, its metal handle worn smooth by countless hands. What struck me most about the location was how isolated it felt. We were near the edge of a small lake that we could barely make out through the fog, its dark water lapping gently against an unseen shore. The entire area felt abandoned, as if we were the first people to visit in months or even years. Rust stains streaked down the sides of the pump house, and spider webs stretched between the buildings, heavy with moisture from the fog. Camden approached the pump handle while Ryan and Brandon stood guard with the empty jugs. The mechanism was stiff at first, requiring both of us to work the handle up and down before water began to flow. The liquid that emerged was ice cold and had a metallic taste that suggested it came from deep underground. As we filled the first jug, the sound of rushing water seemed absurdly loud in the fog-muffled environment. "This place gives me the creeps," Brandon whispered, his voice barely audible over the pumping sounds. He kept glancing around nervously, adjusting his glasses and shifting his weight from foot to foot. "It feels like we're being watched." I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. There was something about the pump house area that felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was the way the fog seemed thicker here, or how the yellow light created harsh shadows that shifted and moved with every small breeze. Or maybe it was the absolute silence from the lake, which should have been alive with the sounds of waterfowl and insects. but instead seemed completely dead. As we filled the second jug, Ryan pointed toward the shower building. "Look at that," he said quietly. Through one of the windows, we could see what appeared to be a figure standing motionless inside. The silhouette was barely visible through the grimy glass and fog, but it was definitely human-shaped and seemed to be facing in our direction. We all froze, staring at the window. After several long seconds, Camden called out, "Hello? Is someone in there?" His voice cracked slightly with nervousness. There was no response. The figure didn't move or acknowledge us in any way. After another minute of watching, the silhouette seemed to fade away, though whether it had moved or was simply obscured by shifting fog was impossible to tell. "Probably just shadows," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. "The fog is playing tricks on us." But as we filled the third and final jug, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were indeed being observed. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to duck behind the buildings or slip back into the fog whenever I turned to look directly at them. The other boys were experiencing the same thing. I could see it in their tense postures and the way they kept scanning our surroundings. By the time we finished filling the water jugs, the fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing more of the lake and surrounding area. What we saw didn't make us feel any better. The lake stretched away into the distance, its surface perfectly still and black as oil. No boats were visible, no docks or other signs of human activity. On the far shore, dense forest pressed right up to the water's edge, creating an unbroken wall of dark trees. Loading the 3 full water jugs onto the cart we'd found proved to be more challenging than expected. Each jug now weighed over 40 pounds, and the cart's wooden bed was just barely large enough to accommodate all 3. Camden and I worked together to secure them with some bungee cords we'd brought, while Ryan and Brandon kept watch for any signs of the mysterious figure we'd seen in the shower building. The journey back to the cabin should have been straightforward, but the fog was playing havoc with our sense of direction. The wooden trail markers seemed to appear and disappear at random, and more than once we had to backtrack when the path seemed to fork in directions we didn't remember from our trip down. The cart's wheels, which had rolled smoothly when empty, now squeaked and groaned under the weight of the water, creating a rhythmic noise that seemed to echo strangely in the muffled air. About halfway back, we encountered something that made us all stop dead in our tracks. Stretched across the trail at about chest height was a single strand of spider web, but it was unlike any web I'd ever seen. The silk was thick and almost rope-like, glistening with moisture from the fog. What made it truly disturbing was its placement. It was positioned perfectly to catch someone walking down the trail, and it was far too large and strong to have been created by any ordinary spider. "That wasn't there when we came down," Camden said quietly, his voice tight with anxiety. He was right. We definitely would have walked into it on our way to the pump house. Someone or something had placed it there while we were filling the water jugs. Brandon laughed nervously. "Maybe it's just a really big spider, like those ones you see in nature documentaries." But his attempt at humor fell flat. We all knew that no spider in Michigan could create a web like this. I used a stick to break the web and clear the path, but the incident left us all even more on edge. As we continued toward the cabin, I noticed that the boys were unconsciously bunching together, staying as close to the cart as possible. The fog seemed to be closing in around us again, reducing our visibility to just a few feet in any direction. When we finally reached the cabin, the other scouts and leaders greeted us with obvious relief. Apparently, we'd been gone much longer than anyone expected, nearly 3 hours for what should have been a simple 1-hour round trip. Mr. Rodriguez looked particularly concerned as he helped us unload the water jugs. "Everything go okay down there?" he asked, studying our faces. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost." I exchanged glances with Camden before answering. "Just took longer than we thought. The fog made navigation tricky." I didn't mention the figure in the shower building or the mysterious web across the trail. Something told me that talking about those incidents would only make them seem more real, more threatening. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. The fog finally lifted around 4 o'clock, revealing the full extent of our isolation. In every direction, unbroken forest stretched to the horizon. No roads were visible, no power lines, no signs of civilization except for the faint trail we'd followed to the pump house. The cabin suddenly felt like a tiny island of safety in a vast ocean of wilderness. As evening approached, Mr. Rodriguez made an announcement that filled me with dread. "We're going to need more water for tonight and tomorrow morning," he said, gesturing toward the 3 jugs we'd brought back. "A couple of you will need to make another run down to the pump house after dinner." My stomach dropped. The thought of returning to that isolated, fog-shrouded location was terrifying enough in daylight. The idea of going there after dark was almost unbearable. By 9 o'clock that evening, the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and a light frost was beginning to form on the cabin's windows. Inside, we'd built up a roaring fire in the stone fireplace, but the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the chill that had settled deep in my bones. When Mr. Rodriguez approached Camden and me about making the water run, I felt my heart begin to race. "I know it's not ideal timing," he said apologetically, "but we really can't wait until morning. We need water for cooking breakfast and cleaning up." He handed us each a heavy-duty flashlight and pointed toward the door. "Take the cart again and stick to the main trail. You should be back within an hour." I pulled on my heaviest coat and a pair of insulated gloves, but no amount of clothing could protect me from the feeling of dread that was growing stronger by the minute. From the moment I stepped outside the cabin's warm interior, every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around and go back inside. The darkness beyond our flashlight beams was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow light and sound. Camden was trying to project confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as we loaded the empty water jugs onto the cart. "It's just a quick trip," he said, as much to himself as to me. "Down and back, no problem." The trail that had been merely unsettling in daylight fog now felt actively malevolent in the darkness. Our flashlight beams created moving circles of visibility that only emphasized how much we couldn't see. The pine trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches creating overhead canopies that blocked out even the faint starlight. Every few steps, we'd hear sounds in the darkness: snapping twigs, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl that sounded almost human. About 10 minutes into our journey, we reached the area where we'd found the cart earlier that day. During daylight, it had seemed like a perfectly normal section of trail. Now, in the darkness, it felt like entering a different world entirely. The trees here were older and larger, their massive trunks disappearing into the blackness above our heads. The undergrowth was thicker too, creating countless hiding places where anything could be lurking just beyond the reach of our lights. "Did you hear that?" Camden whispered suddenly, stopping so abruptly that I nearly crashed the cart into him. I listened carefully, but heard only the wind moving through the pine needles overhead. "Hear what?" "Footsteps, like someone walking parallel to the trail, keeping pace with us." His voice was barely audible, and I could see his hands shaking as he gripped his flashlight. We stood motionless for nearly a minute, straining to hear anything unusual. The forest around us was silent, except for the natural sounds of wind and settling branches. But as we started walking again, I began to notice what Camden was talking about. There was a subtle rhythm in the background noise, a pattern that seemed to match our own footsteps but remained just out of sync enough to be noticeable. "It's probably just echoes," I said. But my voice lacked conviction. The sound was too deliberate, too consistent to be a simple echo. Whatever was making it was definitely keeping pace with us, staying roughly 20 or 30 feet off the trail, but matching our speed exactly. As we approached the fenced area where the canoes and kayaks were stored, the feeling of being watched intensified dramatically. The chain-link fence created geometric shadows in our flashlight beams, turning the familiar storage area into a maze of dark spaces where anything could be hiding. The boats themselves, overturned and covered with tarps, looked like sleeping animals in the darkness. "I can't do this," I said suddenly, stopping the cart and turning to face Camden. "Something is seriously wrong out here. We need to go back and get more people, or wait until morning." Camden's face was pale in the flashlight beam, but he shook his head stubbornly. "We're already halfway there. It would take just as long to go back as to keep going forward." He was right, mathematically speaking, but every fiber of my being was telling me to retreat. The sensation of being stalked had grown so strong that I felt like prey being herded toward a trap. But Camden was already walking ahead, and I couldn't abandon him to face whatever was out there alone. The pump house area looked entirely different in the darkness. The single yellow light above the door cast harsh shadows that seemed to move and shift with every small breeze, creating a constantly changing landscape of bright spots and impenetrable black pools. The lake beyond was invisible except for the occasional glint of reflected light on its surface, making it feel like we were standing at the edge of an abyss. As we approached the pump, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The area around the buildings, which had been empty during our afternoon visit, was now littered with what looked like debris. Pieces of cloth, scattered papers, and dark stains on the concrete that definitely hadn't been there before. Camden saw it too, and we both stopped about 20 feet away from the pump. Maybe someone else was here, he suggested, but his voice was uncertain. Another camping group or something. I swept my flashlight beam across the scattered materials, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The cloth pieces looked like they might have been clothing at one point, but they were now just torn rags covered in mud and what might have been dried blood. The papers were too damaged to read, but they appeared to be pages torn from books or magazines. "We should go back," I said firmly. "Right now. Something happened here." But before Camden could respond, we heard a sound that made both of us freeze in terror. From somewhere inside the shower building came a low, rhythmic thumping noise like someone pounding on a wall or door. The sound was muffled but persistent, and it seemed to be coming from multiple locations within the building simultaneously. Camden grabbed my arm. "There's someone trapped in there," he whispered urgently. "We have to help them." Every rational part of my mind was screaming that this was exactly the wrong thing to do, but the possibility that someone was in distress overrode my survival instincts. We approached the shower building cautiously, our flashlights trained on the dark windows. The thumping sounds continued, sometimes from the left side of the building, sometimes from the right, as if whatever was making them was moving around inside. "Hello?" Camden called out, his voice echoing strangely in the night air. "Is someone in there? Do you need help?" The thumping stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. We waited for several long minutes, but there was no response, no indication that anyone had heard us. "Maybe it was just pipes," I suggested weakly. "Old building, water pressure issues." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The sounds had been too deliberate, too purposeful. And now, as we stood in the harsh yellow light, I was becoming aware of another disturbing detail. The ground around the shower building was covered with footprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all leading to and from the building in a chaotic pattern that suggested frantic activity. Some of the prints were clearly human, but others were harder to identify. They were roughly the same size as human footprints, but seemed to have an odd shape, as if the person making them had been wearing unusual shoes or had some kind of physical deformity. "We need to fill the water and get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Right now." Camden nodded, and we hurried to the pump. The mechanism worked exactly as it had during our afternoon visit, but every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The squeak of the handle, the rush of water into the jugs, even our own breathing seemed absurdly loud. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was approaching from the darkness behind us. As we filled the second jug, the thumping sounds from the shower building resumed. This time, they were accompanied by what sounded like scratching or scraping, as if someone was dragging fingernails across metal or concrete. The noises were definitely coming from inside the building, but they seemed to be moving around in ways that defied logic, sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from what sounded like underground. "Hurry up," Camden urged, his voice tight with panic. "Whatever's in there, I don't want to meet it." We were loading the third and final jug onto the cart when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Something large and dark had emerged from behind the pump house and was moving toward us with deliberate, measured steps. I spun around, training my flashlight beam in that direction, but the light revealed only empty ground and the dark tree line beyond. "Did you see that?" I asked Camden, but he was already pushing the cart toward the trail, eager to get away from the pump house area. "I saw something," he replied grimly. "Let's talk about it when we're back at the cabin." The return journey began badly and only got worse. The cart, now loaded with over 120 pounds of water, was much harder to maneuver on the uneven trail. The wheels caught on roots and rocks, and several times we nearly lost control entirely as we navigated around curves in the darkness. Our flashlight beams, which had seemed adequate on the way down, now felt pathetically weak against the surrounding blackness. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Camden suddenly grabbed my arm. "Listen," he whispered urgently. I stopped pushing the cart and strained my ears. At first, I heard only the normal sounds of the forest, wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of settling branches. But then I caught it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the trail behind us. Not the subtle, off-rhythm sounds we'd heard earlier, but clear, deliberate footsteps that were definitely following us and getting closer. We both turned around, shining our flashlights back down the trail. The beams revealed nothing but empty paths stretching away into the darkness, but the footstep sounds continued. Whatever was making them was staying just beyond the reach of our lights, matching our pace and maintaining a consistent distance. "Maybe it's another camper," Camden suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Someone else who needed water." I didn't bother responding. Every instinct I possessed was telling me that whatever was following us was not another camper. The footsteps had an odd quality to them, as if the person making them was having trouble maintaining a normal walking rhythm. Sometimes they came in quick bursts, sometimes they dragged slightly, and occasionally they seemed to pause for several seconds before resuming. We picked up our pace, pushing the cart as fast as we dared on the rough trail. The footsteps behind us immediately matched our increased speed. When we slowed down to navigate around a fallen branch, the sound slowed down too. Whatever was back there was definitely tracking us. As we approached the fenced area with the canoes and kayaks, the feeling of impending danger became almost overwhelming. This was the same spot where I'd felt most uneasy during our afternoon trip, and now, in the darkness, it felt like walking into an ambush. The chain-link fence created a maze of shadows, and the overturned boats provided countless hiding places for anything that might be waiting for us. "We need to move fast through this section," I told Camden. "Don't stop for anything." He nodded, and we pushed the cart forward at a near-jogging pace. The water jugs bounced and sloshed with our increased speed, and I was terrified that one of them would fall off and we'd have to stop to retrieve it. The footsteps behind us were getting closer now, no longer making any attempt at stealth. I could hear them clearly over the sound of the cart wheels and our own labored breathing. We were about halfway through the fenced area when Camden suddenly screamed. "What the hell is that?" I spun around to look where he was pointing, and my blood froze in my veins. Standing at the far end of the fenced area, clearly visible in our combined flashlight beams, was a figure that looked human, but moved in ways that were definitely not human. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to flutter and shift even though there was no wind. But what made it truly terrifying was the way it moved, not walking or running, but flowing across the ground like smoke, covering distance with impossible speed. "Run!" I shouted, abandoning any pretense of staying calm. We both broke into a sprint, leaving the cart behind in our panic. Camden, being smaller and faster, immediately pulled ahead of me, but I kept pace as best I could despite my injured knee and the 30-pound backpack I was still wearing. Behind us, I could hear the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, moving much faster than any human could run. The trail that had seemed endless during our careful walk down now flashed by in a blur of pine trees and shadows. My lungs burned from the cold air and exertion, and my injured knee was sending shooting pains up my leg with every step, but I didn't dare slow down. Whatever was chasing us was gaining ground, and I could hear it breathing. Deep, ragged gasps that sounded more animal than human. Camden was shouting something ahead of me, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of my own pounding heartbeat and the crashing noises behind us. All I could think about was reaching the cabin, getting inside, and barricading the door against whatever was out there in the darkness. We burst through the cabin door like our lives depended on it, which they very well might have. Camden immediately slammed the door behind us and threw the deadbolt, while I collapsed onto the nearest chair, gasping for breath and shaking uncontrollably. The warm interior of the cabin felt like a sanctuary after the nightmare we'd just experienced, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly safe yet. Mr. Rodriguez and several other scouts immediately surrounded us, demanding to know what had happened and where we'd left the water. Between gasping breaths, I managed to explain that we'd had to abandon the cart and run, though I left out most of the details about what we'd seen. Camden was in even worse shape than me. shaking so badly he could barely speak. "Something was chasing us," he finally managed to say. "It wasn't human. It moved like nothing I've ever seen before." Mr. Rodriguez looked skeptical but concerned. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear or a deer that spooked you? The mind can play tricks on you in the dark woods." I wanted to tell him about the figure we'd seen, about the way it had moved across the ground without seeming to touch it, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Instead, I just nodded and let him think we'd been frightened by a wild animal. After we'd warmed up and calmed down somewhat, Camden pulled me aside and described what he'd seen that made him scream. "When we got to the fence area," he said quietly, "I saw someone in my peripheral vision. A man, but not normal. He was running toward us at full speed, but he was running wrong, like his legs were too long, or his joints bent the wrong way. And when I blinked and looked directly at him, he just vanished. I believed him completely. I'd heard the running footsteps and had seen something myself, a dark silhouette that seemed to flicker in and out of existence at the edge of my vision. Whatever had been stalking us through the forest was not a bear or a deer or any other normal woodland creature. None of us got much rest that night. Every small sound outside the cabin, the wind in the trees, settling branches, the distant call of an owl, made us all tense up and stare toward the windows. I kept my flashlight next to my sleeping bag and jumped at every shadow that moved across the moonlit walls. When dawn finally arrived, painting the forest in shades of gray and gold, Mr. Rodriguez organized a search party to retrieve the abandoned water cart. I volunteered to go along, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I needed to see the area in daylight to convince myself that what we'd experienced was real. The walk back to the fenced area in broad daylight was surreal. The trail that had seemed so threatening in the darkness now looked perfectly normal, just a dirt path winding through pine trees. But when we reached the spot where we'd abandoned the cart, we found evidence that our terror had been justified. The cart was exactly where we'd left it, with all 3 water jugs still secure in the wooden bed. But the ground around it told a disturbing story. The soft earth was covered with footprints, dozens of them, all apparently made by the same person. The prints circled the cart multiple times, as if someone had been examining it carefully from every angle. But these weren't normal footprints. They were elongated and narrow, at least twice as long as any human foot should be. The impressions were deep too, suggesting that whatever made them was either very heavy or moving with tremendous force. Most disturbing of all, some of the prints showed what appeared to be claw marks at the toe end. Camden and I exchanged glances but said nothing. Mr. Rodriguez and the other adults examined the prints with obvious puzzlement, but no one offered any explanations. We loaded the cart and headed back to the cabin in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd discovered. As we packed up our gear later that morning, preparing for the drive home, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief to be leaving. The cabin that had seemed like an adventure just 2 days earlier now felt like a trap, and the surrounding forest seemed to press in on us with malevolent intent. But as our convoy of vehicles pulled away from the clearing and began the long drive back to civilization, I caught one final glimpse of something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. In my side mirror, I saw a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us leave. It was too far away to make out any details, but something about its posture and the way it held itself made it clear that it wasn't human. Camden saw it too. He gripped my arm and pointed back toward the cabin, but when we both turned around to look directly, the figure was gone. Only empty forest remained, peaceful and normal in the morning sunlight. To this day, I'm not sure what we encountered in those woods. Was it some kind of hermit living wild in the forest? A person with severe mental illness who had been stalking campers? Or was it something else entirely? Something that science hasn't cataloged and probably wouldn't believe? I've never been able to find the exact location of that cabin again. Mr. Rodriguez left our scout troop a few months later, and the rental records seem to have disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if the whole experience was some kind of shared delusion, a mass hysteria brought on by isolation and darkness. But then, I remember the footprints we found the next morning, and the look of absolute terror on Camden's face when he saw that figure running toward us. Whatever was stalking us through those dark woods was real, and it's still out there somewhere, waiting in the shadows for the next group of unsuspecting campers to venture too far from safety. I pray to God that I never have to find out what it really was. The summer of 2019 started like any other for me, an 11-year-old kid from suburban Minnesota. My parents had enrolled me in Cedar Ridge Summer Camp, a rustic facility nestled deep in the North Woods, 3 hours from the nearest town. The promotional brochures showed happy children swimming in crystal-clear lakes and roasting marshmallows around campfires. But nothing could have prepared me for what I would experience during those 2 weeks in July. I arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder and my stomach churning with nervous excitement. The camp consisted of 12 weathered wooden cabins arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central fire pit. Towering pine trees created a canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, shadows danced ominously across the ground. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine needles and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something musty and decaying that seemed to emanate from the deeper parts of the forest. My cabin, number 7, housed 8 boys and was supervised by a counselor named Brett, a lanky college sophomore with sun-bleached hair and an easy smile that somehow never quite reached his eyes. My bunk was positioned near the back wall, directly beneath a small window that faced the woods. The floorboards creaked and groaned with every step, and the thin mattress smelled faintly of mildew despite the fresh sheets. My bunkmate was a kid named Connor from Milwaukee, a stocky 12-year-old with freckles and an infectious laugh. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared love of horror movies and video games. As we unpacked our belongings that first afternoon, Connor regaled me with stories he'd heard about the camp from his older brother, who had attended 3 years prior. "Brandon told me weird stuff happens here at night," Connor whispered as we arranged our clothes in the shared dresser. "He said they had to move kids out of cabin 12 because of some kind of incident. Nobody talks about it anymore." I laughed it off then, assuming it was just typical camp folklore designed to spook newcomers. The rational part of my brain dismissed such tales as harmless fun, but something about the way Connor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper made the hair on my arms stand up. That evening, we gathered around the central fire pit for orientation and introductions. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, creating the illusion that the forest itself was alive and watching us. Brett and the other counselors led us through camp songs and shared the rules and expectations for our stay. Everything seemed normal enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed by something lurking just beyond the ring of firelight. As bedtime approached, the counselors herded us back to our respective cabins. The transition from the warm glow of the campfire to the suffocating darkness of the woods was jarring. Our flashlights created small circles of light that seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast expanse of blackness surrounding us. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made my heart skip a beat. Once inside cabin 7, Brett gave us the nightly rundown, lights out by 10:30. No talking after that time, and absolutely no leaving the cabin until morning unless it was a genuine emergency. The bathroom facilities were housed in a separate building about 50 yards away, connected to our cabin by a narrow gravel path. A single motion sensor light illuminated the route, but its coverage was sporadic at best. As I lay in my bunk that first night, listening to the settling sounds of the old building and the gentle snoring of my fellow campers, I felt reasonably safe. The camp had been operating for over 30 years without any serious incidents, and the staff seemed competent and caring. Whatever stories Connor's brother had shared were probably exaggerated tales designed to enhance the camp's mystique. If only I had known then how wrong I was. The second night at Cedar Ridge started innocently enough. We had spent the day hiking along the lakeshore, learning basic wilderness survival skills and participating in a capture-the-flag tournament that left us all exhausted but exhilarated. After a dinner of grilled hamburgers and corn on the cob, we returned to our cabin ready for a good night's rest. Connor and I had settled into our bunks around 10:15, whispering about the day's activities and making plans for tomorrow's canoeing expedition. Brett made his rounds, checking that everyone was accounted for and reasonably quiet, before settling into his own bed near the front of the cabin. The familiar sounds of settling wood and distant night birds gradually lulled most of the boys to sleep. I must have drifted off around 11, but sometime later, my watch showed it was exactly 2:17 a.m. when I first looked. I was jolted awake by a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping directly above my head, as if something enormous was walking across the roof with deliberate, measured steps. Each footfall sent vibrations through the entire structure, causing the wooden beams to creak and groan in protest. But it wasn't just the footsteps that made my stomach clench with fear. Between each heavy thud, I could distinctly hear what sounded like deep, labored breathing. The kind of breathing you might expect from something that had been running hard or carrying an enormous weight. The sound was so close that it seemed to be coming from just inches above the thin roof, and I could swear I felt warm air moving through the gaps in the wooden planks. I lay frozen in my bunk, every muscle tensed, and my heart hammering so hard I was certain everyone in the cabin could hear it. Connor was still asleep in the bunk next to mine, his face peaceful and undisturbed. Across the room, I could see that several other boys were stirring restlessly, but none seemed fully awake. Even Brett appeared to be sleeping soundly, his breathing deep and regular. The walking continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Whatever was up there moved with purpose, traversing the length of the roof from one end to the other in a methodical pattern. Occasionally, the footsteps would pause directly over my bunk, and during these moments, the breathing would become more pronounced, almost as if the thing was listening or searching for something specific. I wanted desperately to wake Connor or call out to Brett, but something primal and instinctual kept me silent. Every fiber of my being screamed that drawing attention to myself would be a terrible mistake. Instead, I pulled my sleeping bag up over my head and tried to convince myself that it was just a large animal, maybe a bear or a moose that had somehow found its way onto the roof. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing, I knew that no animal moved with such deliberate precision. No animal breathed with that kind of measured, almost human-like rhythm. And no animal I could think of would be large enough to create footsteps that heavy while still being able to balance on a cabin roof. Eventually, the sounds stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the noise had been, and I spent the remaining hours until dawn, straining my ears for any hint that the thing might return. When morning finally came, I felt as though I hadn't slept at all. At breakfast, I casually mentioned to Connor that I thought I had heard something on the roof during the night. He looked at me with a puzzled expression and said he hadn't heard anything unusual. When I brought it up with a couple of the other boys from our cabin, they gave me similar responses. Either I was the only light sleeper in the group, or whatever had been up there had specifically chosen to manifest itself only to me. The rational part of my brain suggested that I had probably been dreaming or experiencing some kind of sleep paralysis episode. Camp was a new environment, and it made sense that my subconscious might conjure up strange scenarios. But deep down, I knew what I had heard was real. The memory of those deliberate footsteps and labored breathing was too vivid, too detailed to be the product of my imagination. As we prepared for another day of camp activities, I made a mental note to pay closer attention to my surroundings and to trust my instincts if anything else seemed amiss. What I didn't realize was that the previous night's events were just the beginning of something far more terrifying than my young mind could have possibly conceived. The third night at Cedar Ridge brought with it a thick humidity that made the air feel heavy and oppressive. Storm clouds had been building throughout the day, and by evening the atmosphere was charged with the electric tension that precedes a major thunderstorm. The temperature had dropped significantly from the sweltering heat we had endured earlier in the week, and most of us had changed into long pants and sweatshirts for the evening campfire. Our nightly gathering around the fire pit was cut short when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Brett and the other counselors quickly herded us back to our cabins as the wind picked up and lightning began to flicker in the distance. Within minutes of reaching Cabin 7, the sky opened up completely, unleashing a torrential downpour that drummed against the roof with an intensity that made conversation nearly impossible. The storm created an entirely different atmosphere in our cabin. Instead of the usual easy chatter and gradual wind down toward bedtime, we found ourselves gathered around our bunks, listening to the thunder rolling across the lake and watching lightning illuminate the windows in brief, stark flashes. The violence of the weather outside made our small wooden shelter feel even more fragile and isolated than usual. Around 10 o'clock, Brett announced that it was time for final bathroom visits before lights out. Due to the severity of the storm, he decided to escort groups of boys to the bathroom facility rather than letting us make the trip individually. The separate bathroom building, which housed toilets and sinks for 3 cabins, was only about 50 yards away, but the combination of driving rain and limited lighting made the journey treacherous. I was in the last group to make the trip, along with Connor and 2 other boys. We pulled on rain jackets and sprint across the muddy path, our flashlights creating weak beams that were quickly swallowed by the darkness and rain. The bathroom building was a simple concrete block structure with no windows except for 4 small rectangular openings near the ceiling that were covered with metal grating. These openings were designed for ventilation, but also served as the only source of natural light during daytime hours. Once inside, we quickly took care of business while Brett waited outside under the small overhang by the door. The interior lighting consisted of 2 fluorescent fixtures that cast harsh, institutional shadows across the white-painted walls. The combination of the storm noise and the buzzing of the fluorescent bulbs created an unsettling ambient sound that made my skin crawl. As we prepared to leave, Brett counted heads and realized that one of the boys from an earlier group had left the lights on when they departed. Camp rules were strict about conserving electricity, and leaving lights on unnecessarily was a violation that could result in lost privileges. Since I was the last person to use the facilities, Brett asked me to go back inside and turn off the lights before we returned to our cabin. I reluctantly agreed, though something about re-entering that sterile, harshly lit space made my stomach tighten with apprehension. The others waited outside while I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped back into the bathroom. The fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, casting their cold light across the concrete floor and utilitarian fixtures. I moved quickly toward the light switches, eager to complete this simple task and rejoin the group. But as I reached for the switches, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet by at least 20 degrees. My breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms beneath my rain jacket. That's when I noticed movement outside one of the small grated windows near the ceiling. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch swaying in the storm wind, but as I looked more closely, I realized that what I was seeing defied any rational explanation. A figure, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, was walking slowly around the perimeter of the bathroom building. The grated window was at least 8 feet from the ground, yet I could clearly see the upper portion of this thing as it moved past each opening in sequence. The lightning provided intermittent illumination that revealed horrifying details I wish I could forget. The figure's skin appeared gray and mottled, stretched tightly over a frame that seemed to consist mostly of jutting bones and sharp angles. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees, and its fingers appeared to be nothing more than skeletal protrusions covered by a thin membrane of flesh. But it was the way it moved that filled me with the most terror. Each step was deliberate and calculated, as if it was searching for something specific. The thing paused at each window, and though I couldn't see its face clearly through the grating, I had the unmistakable sensation that it was peering inside, looking for something or someone. When it reached the window directly above where I was standing, it stopped completely. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the figure remained motionless outside that window. I could hear its breathing now, the same deep, labored breathing I had heard on the roof 2 nights earlier. The sound was so close and so pronounced that I was certain it was looking directly at me through the metal grating. Terror flooded my system like ice water in my veins. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. My hands shook so violently that I could barely manage to flip the light switches, plunging the bathroom into complete darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning from outside. I stumbled toward the door in the blackness, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As I fumbled for the door handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away from the building, fading gradually into the storm noise. By the time I burst through the door and rejoined Brett and the other boys, whatever I had seen was gone. The return trip to our cabin was a blur of rain and terror. I said nothing to the others about what I had witnessed, partly because I doubted they would believe me, and partly because I was still trying to process what I had seen myself. Once back in our bunk, I lay awake for hours, listening to the storm and jumping at every sound, no matter how innocent. When morning came and the storm had passed, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was a product of fear and imagination, amplified by the dramatic weather and the harsh lighting in the bathroom. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that something real and terrifying was stalking the grounds of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of perfect weather that makes summer camps profitable and parents happy. The storm had washed the air clean, and everything sparkled with residual moisture that caught the early sunlight like thousands of tiny diamonds. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a beautiful day for outdoor activities and camp adventures. But I found it impossible to enjoy the sunshine and fresh air when my mind kept replaying the events of the previous night. During breakfast, I studied the faces of my fellow campers and the counselors, searching for any sign that someone else had seen or heard something unusual. Everyone seemed relaxed and cheerful, discussing plans for the day's activities and making jokes about who had been most frightened by the thunder. Connor noticed my distracted state and asked if I was feeling all right. I considered telling him about what I had witnessed in the bathroom, but something held me back. How could I explain that I had seen an 8-foot-tall skeletal figure stalking around the building without sounding like I was either lying or losing my mind? Instead, I mumbled something about not sleeping well due to the storm and tried to focus on my scrambled eggs. After breakfast, our activity schedule called for a nature hike along one of the trails that wound through the forest surrounding the camp. Brett divided us into smaller groups and assigned each group a different route, with the understanding that we would all meet back at the main lodge for lunch. Connor and I ended up in a group of 6 boys exploring what was called the North Trail, a 2-mile loop that supposedly offered excellent opportunities for wildlife observation and plant identification. As we walked deeper into the woods, I found myself paying attention to details that had previously escaped my notice. The trees in this part of the forest were older and larger than those immediately surrounding the camp, creating a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. The undergrowth was sparse, consisting mainly of ferns and moss that thrived in the perpetual twilight beneath the towering pines. About halfway through our hike, we came across something that made my blood freeze. In a small clearing where a massive oak tree had fallen years earlier, the ground was covered with what appeared to be footprints. But these weren't the prints of any animal I had ever seen or studied in nature books. They were humanoid in shape but impossibly large, easily 18 inches long and proportionally narrow. The impressions were deep, suggesting that whatever had made them was extremely heavy, and they led from the tree line on one side of the clearing to the other. I knelt down to examine the prints more closely while the other boys continued their plant collecting and general exploration. The level of detail preserved in the soft earth was remarkable. I could see distinct toe impressions, each one unnaturally long and ending in what appeared to be sharp points. The heel print was narrow and deep, as if the thing that made it walked primarily on the balls of its feet. "Hey, check this out," called one of the other boys from across the clearing. "There's something weird over here." We all gathered around what he had discovered, scratches in the bark of several trees that formed an unmistakable pattern. The marks were too high off the ground to have been made by any normal animal, and they were too regular and deliberate to be the result of natural wear or storm damage. Someone or something had carved these symbols into the trees with considerable force and precision. Brett, who had been examining some wildflowers nearby, came over to investigate. When he saw the scratches, his expression changed from casual interest to something that looked like concern or possibly recognition. He studied the marks for several long moments before announcing that it was time to move on and complete our hike. "What do you think made those marks?" Connor asked as we resumed walking. "Probably just bears marking their territory," Brett replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "It's pretty common in these woods." I wanted to point out that the scratches were too high and too precise to be bear marks, and that the footprints we had found didn't match any bear tracks I had ever seen. But something about Brett's demeanor discouraged further questions. He seemed eager to put distance between our group and the clearing, and he maintained a brisk pace for the remainder of our hike. That afternoon, during a brief rest period between activities, I decided to do some investigating on my own. The camp had a small library in the main lodge, consisting mostly of nature guides and basic reference books for educational purposes. I told Connor I wanted to look up some of the plants we had seen on our hike, which wasn't entirely untrue, and spent an hour browsing through field guides and wildlife references. What I found was both fascinating and terrifying. Several of the books contained sections on local folklore and historical accounts of the region, including stories dating back to the early logging days of the late 1800s. According to these accounts, the area around what was now Cedar Ridge had been the site of numerous unexplained disappearances and strange sightings over the past century and a half. The most relevant account came from a 1923 newspaper article that had been reprinted in one of the local history books. It described the discovery of a logging camp that had been mysteriously abandoned overnight, with no signs of struggle or obvious explanation for why the workers had fled. The only clues were a series of enormous footprints found around the perimeter of the camp and strange scratches carved into nearby trees. The description of the footprints matched what we had seen in the clearing that morning with unsettling accuracy. According to the article, they were of human configuration, but far larger than any man could produce, with elongated toes terminating in what appeared to be claws or talons. The tree scratches were described as deliberate markings suggesting intelligence and purpose rather than random animal behavior. As I read these accounts, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there would be reports of unusual activity in this part of the forest: missing persons, abandoned campsites, livestock found dead under mysterious circumstances. The incidents would cluster over a period of weeks or months, then disappear for years at a time, only to resurface when conditions were right. The most recent cluster of incidents had occurred in the summer of 2016, just 3 years before my arrival at camp. According to a brief mention in a local newspaper archive, a family camping in the area had reported seeing a tall, emaciated figure stalking around their campsite during the night. They had packed up and left the following morning, despite having reserved the site for a full week. By the time I finished my research, I was more convinced than ever that something genuinely dangerous was active in the area around Cedar Ridge. The question was whether the camp administrators were aware of this history and simply choosing to ignore it, or if they were deliberately concealing information that could affect the safety of their campers. Either way, I realized that I was probably on my own when it came to dealing with whatever was lurking in the woods around our camp. The rational adult response would be to pack up and leave immediately, but as an 11-year-old camper with no control over my transportation or living arrangements, that option wasn't available to me. All I could do was stay alert, trust my instincts, and hope that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on before something truly terrible happened. By the 5th night at Cedar Ridge, I had developed a routine of hypervigilance that was beginning to take a serious toll on my physical and mental state. I was sleeping poorly, eating little, and jumping at every unexpected sound or movement. Connor had noticed my increasing anxiety and had begun asking pointed questions about my well-being, but I continued to deflect his concerns with vague explanations about homesickness and adjustment difficulties. The truth was that I had been experiencing minor encounters with whatever was stalking the campgrounds almost every night since the bathroom incident. These weren't dramatic, obvious sightings like what I had witnessed during the storm, but rather subtle signs that something unnatural was taking an active interest in our presence. On the 4th night, I had awakened around 3 a.m. to the sound of something large moving through the underbrush directly behind our cabin. The movement was too deliberate and sustained to be a deer or other normal wildlife, and it seemed to circle our building multiple times before moving off toward the lake. In the morning, I found a series of broken branches and disturbed vegetation that traced the exact path I had heard the night before. The night after that, I noticed that the motion sensor light on the path to the bathroom was triggering repeatedly throughout the early morning hours, turning on for exactly 90 seconds before shutting off again. This cycle continued every 10 to 15 minutes from approximately 2 a.m. until dawn, but whenever I peered out the window to see what might be triggering the sensor, I saw nothing but empty pathway. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that had begun emanating from the forest around midnight each night. They started as distant, almost subsonic groaning noises that seemed to come from deep underground. Gradually, these sounds would increase in frequency and intensity until they resembled a kind of primitive communication, long, mournful calls that were answered by similar sounds from different directions in the woods. On the 5th night, these patterns escalated to a level that I could no longer ignore or rationalize away. Connor and I had gone to bed at the usual time, and I had spent several hours lying awake, listening for any unusual activity. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the now familiar sound of heavy footsteps on the roof, but this time they were accompanied by a new element that made my stomach clench with terror. Scratching. deliberate, rhythmic scratching that sounded like something was trying to claw its way through the wooden shingles and into our cabin. The scratching started directly above my bunk and continued for what felt like hours. I could hear individual claws or talons scraping against the wood, accompanied by the occasional sound of small pieces of debris raining down on the roof as material was gouged away. The rhythm was too regular and purposeful to be the result of an animal trying to build a nest or seek shelter. This was something attempting to gain entry to our sleeping area. I lay frozen in my bunk, afraid to move or make any sound that might draw attention to my specific location. Around me, my fellow campers continued to sleep peacefully, apparently oblivious to the activity taking place just inches above their heads. Even Connor, who was normally a light sleeper, showed no signs of being disturbed by the noise. After what seemed like an eternity, the scratching stopped as abruptly as it had begun. But instead of the relief I had expected to feel, I was gripped by an even more intense fear. If the thing had stopped trying to claw through the roof, what was it planning to do instead? My question was answered about 20 minutes later when I heard the soft sound of the cabin's front door opening. The door was supposed to be locked from the inside with a simple sliding bolt, but I distinctly heard the metallic scraping sound of the bolt being moved and the creak of hinges as the door swung open. Brett's sleeping area was positioned so that he should have been awakened immediately by any intrusion, but his breathing remained deep and regular. Soft footsteps began moving across the cabin floor toward the sleeping area where the campers' bunks were arranged. The footsteps were careful and measured, avoiding the creakiest floorboards with the precision of someone intimately familiar with the building's layout. I could track the progress of whatever had entered by listening to the slight sounds of displaced air and the barely perceptible vibrations transmitted through the wooden structure. The footsteps paused at the foot of each bunk, remaining motionless for 30 to 40 seconds before moving on to the next sleeping boy. I realized with growing horror that the thing was examining each of us individually, perhaps trying to determine which camper might be most suitable for whatever purpose it had in mind. When the footsteps reached my bunk, I had to exercise every ounce of self-control I possessed to maintain the facade of sleep. Through barely cracked eyelids, I could see a tall, impossibly thin shadow looming over my bed. The shadow had no defined edges, seeming to blend into the surrounding darkness, but I could sense its presence with a clarity that transcended normal sight. For what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, the thing stood absolutely still beside my bunk. I could hear its breathing, the same deep, labored respirations I had heard before, and I could smell something that reminded me of wet earth and decay. The temperature around my bed seemed to drop by several degrees, and I had to concentrate on keeping my own breathing slow and regular, despite the panic flooding my system. Eventually, the shadow moved away from my bunk and continued its survey of the other sleeping boys. When it had apparently examined everyone in the cabin, the footsteps retraced their path toward the front door. I heard the door open and close again, followed by the sound of the bolt sliding back into place. But instead of leaving the area entirely, whatever had been in our cabin began circling the building from the outside. I could track its movement by listening to the soft sounds of displaced gravel and vegetation as it moved around the perimeter. Every few minutes, it would pause at one of the windows, and I could sense it peering inside, as if memorizing details about our sleeping arrangements for future reference. This surveillance continued until approximately 4 a.m., when the sounds finally faded into the general background noise of the forest. By the time dawn arrived, I was emotionally and physically exhausted, but I was also more determined than ever to find out what was happening at Cedar Ridge and why none of the adults seemed aware of or concerned about the obvious danger we were facing. As my fellow campers began stirring and preparing for another day of camp activities, I made a decision that would ultimately change the course of events. I was going to confront Brett directly about the strange occurrences, regardless of whether he believed me or dismissed my concerns as the overactive imagination of a frightened child. Something evil was stalking the grounds of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp, and it was escalating its behavior with each passing night. If the adults in charge weren't going to protect us, then I would have to find a way to protect myself and my fellow campers, even if it meant revealing knowledge that no 11-year-old should possess. The sixth morning at Cedar Ridge dawned gray and oppressive, with thick clouds that seemed to press down on the forest like a suffocating blanket. The usual cheerful breakfast chatter was replaced by a subdued atmosphere that I initially attributed to the gloomy weather. But as I looked around the dining hall, I noticed that several other campers appeared tired and on edge. Connor picked at his pancakes without enthusiasm, and when I asked if he was feeling all right, he gave me a strange look before answering. "I had the weirdest dreams last night," he said quietly. "I kept dreaming that someone was in our cabin standing next to my bed and watching me sleep. It felt so real that I woke up several times to check, but there was never anyone there." My blood went cold. Connor's dream perfectly matched what I had witnessed during the early morning hours, but from his perspective as someone who had remained asleep throughout the actual intrusion. If whatever was stalking us had the ability to influence the sleep and dreams of its targets, it explained why I seemed to be the only camper fully aware of the ongoing danger. I looked around the dining hall and noticed similar signs of disturbed sleep among several other boys. Dark circles under their eyes, distracted expressions, and an overall sense of unease that seemed disproportionate to the minor discomfort of sleeping in unfamiliar surroundings. Whatever was affecting the camp wasn't limiting its attention to our specific cabin. After breakfast, I asked Brett if I could speak with him privately about a personal matter. He agreed, and we walked to a quiet area behind the main lodge where we could talk without being overheard by other campers. I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind dozens of times, but now that the moment had arrived, I found it difficult to know where to begin. "Brett," I said finally, "have you noticed anything unusual happening around camp at night? Strange sounds or other things?" His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but I caught a flash of something that looked like recognition before he composed himself and assumed a concerned, counselor demeanor. "What kind of strange sounds?" he asked carefully. I decided to be direct. "Footsteps on the roof. Something walking around the buildings. Heavy breathing. And last night, something came into our cabin while everyone was sleeping." Brett was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was much more serious than his usual casual tone. "How long have you been noticing these things?" "Since the second night. It's been getting worse every night since then." "Have you mentioned this to any of the other boys?" "No. They all seem to sleep through it. Except Connor thinks he's been having weird dreams." Brett nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Listen," he said. "I need you to promise me that you won't discuss this with any of the other campers. Can you do that?" "Why? What's going on?" "There are some things about this place that most people don't need to know about, things that we normally don't have to deal with during camp sessions. But every few years, when conditions are right, we get some unusual activity in the area." "What kind of activity?" Brett glanced around to make sure we were still alone, then continued in a voice barely above a whisper. "The land where this camp is built has a history. A long history of things that can't be easily explained. Most of the time, whatever lives in these woods keeps to itself and doesn't bother people, but sometimes, especially during certain weather patterns or when there are a lot of people around, it gets curious. We're not exactly sure what it is. The local authorities have theories, but nothing that would satisfy most people. What we do know is that it's been here longer than the camp, longer than the logging operations that came before, probably longer than any human settlement in this area." I felt a mixture of validation and terror. At least I wasn't going crazy. But the confirmation that something genuinely dangerous was stalking us wasn't exactly comforting either. "Does the camp director know about this?" I asked. "The camp director, the local sheriff, the Department of Natural Resources, they all know. There's an informal understanding that as long as the incidents remain minor and no one gets hurt, everyone just manages the situation quietly." "What do you mean, manages the situation?" "We keep detailed records of any unusual activity. We have protocols for moving campers out of certain cabins if necessary, and we have arrangements with local law enforcement for emergency evacuations if things get too serious." "How serious do things usually get?" Brett hesitated before answering. "In the 32 years this camp has been operating, we've had to evacuate early 3 times. The last time was 2016. A family camping in the area reported an encounter that was significant enough to warrant shutting down operations for the remainder of that session." I remembered the newspaper account I had found in the camp library. the family who had packed up and left after seeing a tall, emaciated figure near their campsite. Apparently, their encounter had been serious enough to affect the camp's operations as well. What makes you think I can see it when the other kids can't? Some people are more sensitive to this kind of thing than others. Usually it's adults who have the strongest reactions, but occasionally a child will be particularly aware of unusual activity. In those cases, we try to provide extra support and monitoring to keep everyone safe. Extra support like what? Well, for starters, I'm going to move you to a different cabin tonight. Cabin 3 is farther from the tree line and has better lighting around the perimeter. I'll also make sure that you're never alone when moving between buildings after dark. What about Connor and the other boys in Cabin 7? They'll be fine. Whatever's out there seems to focus its attention on people who can actually perceive it clearly. As long as they continue sleeping through the encounters, they're not at significant risk. I wanted to ask more questions, but Brett indicated that our conversation was over and that we needed to rejoin the group for the morning's scheduled activities. As we walked back toward the main camp area, I felt a confusing mixture of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved to know that I wasn't losing my mind and that responsible adults were aware of the situation. On the other hand, the casual way Brett discussed managing encounters with an unknown entity didn't inspire confidence in the camp's ability to keep us truly safe. That afternoon, during what was supposed to be a rest period, I was moved to Cabin 3 along with my belongings. My new bunkmates were friendly enough, but I could tell that they had been briefed about my adjustment difficulties and instructed to be supportive and inclusive. Brett had clearly crafted a cover story that explained my cabin change without revealing the true reason. As evening approached and we prepared for another night at Cedar Ridge, I found myself hoping that the change of location would be enough to end my encounters with whatever was lurking in the forest. But deep down, I suspected that simply moving to a different cabin wouldn't be sufficient to solve a problem that had been developing for decades. Whatever was out there had taken a specific interest in me, and I doubted that 50 yards of additional distance from the tree line would be enough to discourage its attention. My first night in Cabin 3 started peacefully enough. The building was indeed farther from the forest edge, positioned in the center of the camp complex with better lighting and more activity around it. Brett had assigned me a bunk near the front of the cabin, close to where the counselor slept, and he had made a point of checking on me multiple times during the evening. For the first few hours after lights out, I actually managed to relax somewhat. The normal sounds of settling wood and distant forest noise seemed less threatening in this new environment, and the presence of the counselor so nearby provided a degree of comfort I hadn't felt since arriving at camp. But around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a sound that made my heart skip several beats. Scratching. The same deliberate rhythmic scratching I had heard on the roof of Cabin 7, but this time it was coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Whatever was out there wasn't alone anymore. I lay in my bunk, listening to the sounds of claws or talons scraping against wood and metal from at least 3 different locations around the cabin. The scratching was accompanied by low, guttural sounds that were clearly some form of communication between the entities responsible for the noise. They were coordinating their efforts, working together to achieve some specific goal. The activity continued for about 20 minutes before shifting to a new phase that was even more terrifying. I began to hear the sounds of the entities testing various entry points around the building, rattling door handles, probing window latches, and examining the foundation for weak spots. They were methodical and patient, taking time to thoroughly evaluate each potential avenue of access. When they reached the front door of our cabin, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The metal bolt that secured the door from the inside was being manipulated from the outside, sliding slowly but steadily toward the unlocked position. Whatever these things were, they had learned to defeat the simple security measures that protected sleeping campers. I knew I had to wake the counselor, but I was terrified that any movement or sound would draw the entity's attention to my specific location. Instead, I remained motionless and watched through barely opened eyes as the front door of our cabin swung silently open. 3 figures entered our sleeping area, moving with the same careful precision I had witnessed during the previous intrusion. But this time I could see them more clearly due to the better lighting around Cabin 3. What I saw defied every rational explanation my young mind could conceive. The entities were humanoid in general shape, but grotesquely distorted in their proportions. They stood at least 8 feet tall, with skeletal frames that seemed to consist mostly of jutting bones covered by gray, mottled skin. Their arms were disproportionately long, reaching almost to their knees, and their fingers appeared to be nothing more than sharpened bone protrusions. But it was their faces that filled me with the most horror. They had human features, but stretched and elongated beyond any natural possibility. Their eyes were large and completely black, reflecting available light like the eyes of nocturnal animals. Their mouths were filled with teeth that were too numerous and too sharp, creating expressions that suggested intelligence mixed with predatory hunger. The 3 entities moved through our cabin with obvious familiarity, examining each sleeping camper with the same methodical attention I had experienced in Cabin 7. But this time their behavior was different. Instead of simply observing, they seemed to be making selections, pointing at specific boys and communicating in their low, guttural language. When they reached my bunk, all 3 entities stopped and focused their attention on me. I knew immediately that my pretense of sleep wasn't fooling them. They were aware that I could see them clearly and that I understood the danger they represented. For several long minutes, we engaged in a silent standoff, with me trying to remain motionless while they studied me with obvious interest. Finally, one of the entities reached toward me with its skeletal hand, extending those sharpened finger bones until they were just inches from my face. I could smell the odor of decay and wet earth that seemed to emanate from its skin, and I could hear its breathing, that same deep, labored respiration that had become the soundtrack to my nightmares. At the last possible moment, when I was certain that the thing was about to make physical contact, I couldn't maintain my facade any longer. I bolted upright in my bunk and screamed as loudly as I could, hoping to wake everyone in the cabin and scare away the intruders. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entities recoiled from my sudden movement and vocalizations as if they had been physically burned. They retreated toward the front door with surprising speed, their forms seeming to become less solid and defined as they moved away from the interior lighting. But instead of fleeing the area entirely, they positioned themselves just outside the cabin and began making sounds unlike anything I had ever heard. The guttural communication was replaced by high-pitched wailing that rose and fell in complex patterns, creating a sound that seemed designed to inspire maximum terror and disorientation. My screaming had awakened everyone in the cabin, including the counselor, who immediately turned on all available lights and began checking on each camper. The other boys were confused and frightened by the sudden awakening, but none of them seemed to have any awareness of what had actually transpired. "What's wrong?" the counselor asked as he reached my bunk. "They were in here," I said, pointing toward the front door. 3 of them. They were looking at all of us, and they were going to... I stopped speaking when I realized that the door was closed and securely bolted from the inside. There was no evidence that anyone or anything had entered our cabin, and no indication that the intrusion I had witnessed had actually occurred. But the wailing from outside continued, growing louder and more complex as additional voices joined the chorus from different locations around the camp. Soon, the entire forest seemed to be alive with the sound of these entities calling to each other, creating a symphony of terror that was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Other campers in nearby cabins began waking up and adding their own confused voices to the growing chaos. Counselors emerged from their quarters with flashlights, trying to determine the source of the disturbance and restore order to the camp. Brett appeared at our cabin door within minutes, and after a brief conversation with our counselor, he asked to speak with me privately outside. Despite my terror of leaving the relative safety of the building, I followed him to the same quiet area where we had talked that morning. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said without preamble. I described the entire encounter in detail, from the initial scratching sounds to the final retreat of the entities when I screamed. Brett listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if my account confirmed information he already possessed. "The wailing is new," he said when I finished. "We've never had them react that aggressively to being detected. Usually they withdraw immediately if they realize someone is awake and aware of their presence." "What does that mean?" "It means the situation is escalating beyond what we normally experience. I need to make some phone calls and probably implement our emergency protocols." As if to emphasize his point, the wailing from the forest suddenly intensified, and we could see flashlight beams moving through the trees as additional entities responded to whatever call had been issued. The sound was so loud and so disturbing that several of the younger campers had begun crying, despite the counselor's efforts to calm and reassure them. "We're evacuating," Brett said firmly. "I'm calling for transportation to pick up all campers first thing in the morning. This has gone beyond what we can safely manage." I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that we would soon be away from this place and whatever lived in the surrounding forest, but guilt that my inability to remain hidden had apparently triggered a response that was threatening the entire camp operation. "Is this my fault?" I asked. "No," Brett replied without hesitation. "This has been building since the day you arrived. If anything, your awareness of what was happening probably prevented something much worse from occurring." As we returned to the cabin to help with the evacuation preparations, I realized that my summer camp experience was about to end in a way I could never have imagined. But I also understood that I had gained knowledge and experiences that would stay with me for the rest of my life, knowledge about things that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of normal human understanding. The entities continued their wailing throughout the remainder of the night, creating a constant backdrop of otherworldly sound that made sleep impossible for anyone in the camp. By dawn, their voices had faded back into the forest depths, but the memory of that terrible chorus would haunt my dreams for years to come. The evacuation of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp began at first light, with a convoy of buses and vans arriving to transport 43 campers and 12 staff members back to their respective homes. The official explanation given to parents was an unexpected closure due to severe weather damage and safety concerns, which was technically accurate even if it didn't address the true nature of the threat. As we loaded our belongings onto the buses, I noticed that several of the other campers seemed relieved to be leaving, even though they couldn't articulate why. The events of the previous night had left everyone on edge, and the unnatural silence that had settled over the forest with the dawn felt more ominous than comforting. Connor sat beside me on the bus, but our usual easy conversation was replaced by an uncomfortable silence. I could tell that he wanted to ask questions about what had really happened, but something prevented him from voicing his concerns directly. "Those sounds last night," he said finally, as our bus pulled away from the camp. "They weren't anything normal, were they?" "No," I replied quietly. "They weren't." "Did you see anything when you woke everyone up screaming?" I considered how much to tell him. Part of me wanted to share the full truth about what I had witnessed, but another part recognized that some knowledge was too disturbing to pass along to someone who hadn't asked for it. "I saw enough to know that we needed to get out of there," I said finally. Connor nodded and didn't press for additional details. As our bus traveled the winding forest roads away from Cedar Ridge, I watched through the rear window until the camp buildings disappeared entirely behind the trees. I had the distinct feeling that I was leaving something unfinished, but I was grateful to be putting distance between myself and whatever lived in those woods. The 3-hour bus ride gave me time to process what I had experienced and to begin formulating how I would explain the early end of my camp session to my parents. I decided to stick close to the official story. Severe weather had damaged some facilities and created unsafe conditions that required immediate evacuation. It wasn't entirely false, and it avoided the need to discuss elements that no rational adult would be likely to believe. When I arrived home that afternoon, my parents were surprised by my early return, but seemed satisfied with my explanation. They assumed that my subdued mood and obvious fatigue were natural reactions to the disappointment of having my camp experience cut short, and they gave me space to readjust to being home without excessive questioning. Over the following weeks, I found myself researching everything I could find about the history of the area around Cedar Ridge. I read accounts of the logging operations that had operated there in the late 1800s, the various camping and recreational facilities that had been established over the years, and the folklore that had developed around unexplained incidents in the region. What I discovered confirmed that my experiences were part of a pattern that stretched back over more than a century. Every few years, when conditions were apparently right, there would be reports of unusual activity in the forest, missing persons, abandoned campsites, encounters with entities that defied conventional explanation. The incidents would cluster over a period of weeks or months, then disappear for years at a time. I also learned that Cedar Ridge Summer Camp had indeed been evacuated twice before during its 32-year history, in 1994 and 2016. In both cases, the official explanation had involved weather-related safety concerns, but local newspaper accounts hinted at more complex circumstances that weren't fully explained to the public. About 6 months after my experience at the camp, I received an unexpected phone call from Brett. He was calling to check on how I was doing and to provide some closure about what had happened during my stay. The camp won't be reopening, he told me. The owners have decided that the liability issues have become too significant to continue operations. What about the things in the forest? They're still there, as far as we know. The Department of Natural Resources has expanded the protected area around the former campsite and restricted public access. Officially, it's for environmental conservation purposes. Do you think they'll ever bother people again? Probably. Every few years, when conditions are right, someone will have an encounter. But hopefully future incidents will be isolated and manageable, without putting large groups of people at risk. Brett's call provided some closure, but it also confirmed that I had been part of something much larger and more complex than a simple summer camp experience. I had encountered entities that existed outside normal human understanding, and I had survived that encounter because of a combination of awareness, luck, and the intervention of adults who understood the true nature of the threat. As I grew older and gained more perspective on what had happened to me, I came to understand that there are places in the world where the normal rules of reality don't apply completely. These places exist on the margins of human experience, usually avoided or ignored by people who instinctively recognize their dangerous nature. Cedar Ridge Summer Camp had been built on one of these marginal places, and for 32 years, dedicated staff members had managed to operate there safely by acknowledging the unusual nature of their environment and taking appropriate precautions. But eventually, the risks had become too great to justify continued operations. Today, the former campsite is overgrown and abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that surrounds it. The buildings have been removed, and most traces of human habitation have been erased. But sometimes, on quiet nights when conditions are right, hikers in the area report hearing sounds from the forest that can't be easily explained, sounds that remind me of the wailing chorus I heard during my final night at Cedar Ridge. I still think about those entities sometimes, wondering what they are and where they came from. I wonder if they're still there, waiting in the depths of the forest for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to stumble into their territory. And I'm grateful that my encounter with them ended with an evacuation rather than something far worse. The experience taught me that the world contains mysteries that may never be fully understood or explained, and that sometimes the wisest response to such mysteries is simply to acknowledge their existence and maintain a respectful distance. Some places are meant to remain wild and unexplored, and some entities are better left undisturbed in their ancient territories. Cedar Ridge is one of those places, and I have no intention of ever returning to find out what might be waiting there in the shadows between the trees. The trail seemed innocent enough on the map. Just another backcountry route through Black Ridge National Forest, a 6-day loop promising solitude and breathtaking vistas. I'd been planning this solo trek for months, ever since my job at the software company went remote. The isolation of constant screen time had driven me to seek something real, something primal. "You sure about going alone?" my coworker Michael had asked during our last video call. "Those northern woods get pretty remote." I dismissed his concerns with practiced confidence. "I've done plenty of weekend hikes. Besides, I've got satellite GPS and emergency beacon. Nothing to worry about." That conversation replayed in my mind as I shouldered my pack at the trailhead on a crisp September morning. The parking lot was deserted except for my rental car, a fact that pleased rather than concerned me. The forest stretched before me, ancient pines standing like sentinels against the pale sky. The air carried the sharp scent of resin and wet earth. The first day's hike was moderate, a gradual 2,000-foot elevation gain over 8 miles. My boots crunched through fallen pine needles, the rhythm hypnotic as I adjusted to the weight of my pack. By early afternoon, patches of mist began threading between the trees, transforming the landscape into something from an old folk tale. I made camp at a small clearing near a stream, moving through the familiar motions of setting up my tent and filtering water. The forest felt alive around me. Birds calling from unseen perches, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. It was exactly what I'd come for. After dinner, I sat beside my small camp stove, sipping instant coffee and watching darkness pool beneath the trees. That's when I heard it. A strange, ululating cry that seemed to skirt the edge between human and animal. I froze, cup halfway to my lips. The sound came again, farther away this time. A coyote, perhaps, or some bird I couldn't identify. Yet something about it raised the hair on my arms. I told myself it was natural to feel uneasy in unfamiliar territory. The wilderness operated on different rules than the sanitized world I'd come from. Sleep came fitfully that night. Each snap of a twig or distant call jolted me awake. Around 3 a.m. I emerged from my tent to relieve myself and paused, struck by the absolute stillness. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no nightbirds calling. Even the stream seemed to have hushed its constant murmur. I scanned the trees, my headlamp cutting a weak cone through the darkness. Something reflected the light briefly. 2 points of yellowish gleam about 6 feet off the ground. Then they were gone. "Just an animal," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and unconvincing. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I kept my hunting knife close at hand. When dawn finally broke, I felt foolish for my midnight anxiety. The forest was alive again with birdsong and the rustling of small creatures. I broke camp efficiently, eager to reach the higher elevations where the views would open up. The trail grew steeper, switchbacking up a ridge through increasingly sparse vegetation. By noon, I'd gained enough elevation to look back over the vast wilderness I'd entered. Miles of unbroken forest stretched to the horizon, a dark green sea beneath the overcast sky. It was while taking in this view that I first noticed the footprints. They paralleled my own trail about 20 feet off the path, large, human-like impressions pressing deep into the soft forest floor. They hadn't been there on my ascent. Someone else was out here. That wasn't unusual in itself, but something about those tracks unsettled me. They appeared and disappeared at odd intervals, sometimes visible in patches of mud, then absent where they should have crossed open ground. A rumble of thunder prompted me to continue. The weather report had mentioned possible afternoon storms, and I wanted to reach my planned campsite before they hit. The footprints followed, always keeping pace, always just off trail. I quickened my steps, trying to outpace both the coming storm and my growing unease. The woods seemed to darken prematurely as clouds gathered overhead. When the rain finally came, it arrived in a sudden deluge that forced me to hastily erect my tent in a small clearing. Inside the relative safety of my nylon shelter, I listened to water hammering the rainfly and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Another hiker, surely, perhaps a forest ranger checking the backcountry. The rain continued for hours. As darkness fell, I strained to hear anything beyond the steady drumming of water. Occasionally, I caught what sounded like movement. Something large, displacing the underbrush, circling my campsite with deliberate, unhurried steps. I clutched my flashlight and knife, telling myself it was just a deer or elk seeking shelter. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever moved out there was watching me with cold, calculating intent, and somehow I sensed it knew that I knew. Dawn broke with reluctant gray light filtering through the canopy. The rain had stopped, but fog clung to the trees, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards. I emerged from my tent to find the ground around my campsite unmarked, no footprints, no signs of disturbance. Yet the uneasy feeling remained, a persistent itch between my shoulder blades. I forced down a breakfast of instant oatmeal and packed quickly, eager to be moving. Today's route would take me along a ridgeline before descending into a valley said to contain one of the oldest growth forests in the region. Under different circumstances, I'd have been excited. The trail narrowed as it climbed, hugging the edge of steep drops that vanished into the fog below. I moved cautiously, one hand often reaching for tree trunks or rocks for balance. The mist created an eerie disconnect, as though the visible world ended just a few feet away. Around midday, the fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of the valley below. I paused at a rocky outcropping to rest and check my map. That's when I noticed the arrangement of stones near my feet. Not a natural formation, but 3 smooth river rocks, balanced in a small pyramid. Someone had placed them there deliberately. A marker left by another hiker? Possibly. But the rocks were dry underneath, meaning they'd been placed after the rain stopped this morning. I scanned the surrounding forest but saw no one. Continuing along the ridge, I began finding more signs: broken branches positioned to point in unnatural directions, small cairns where no trail markers should be. Each discovery ratcheted my unease higher. Someone was moving through these woods parallel to me, leaving signs I couldn't fully interpret. By mid-afternoon, I began my descent into the valley. The trail switchbacked down through increasingly dense forest, the ancient trees blocking much of the fading daylight. The shifting shadows played tricks on my peripheral vision, darting movements that vanished when I turned to look directly. I found my designated campsite near a small pond. Park regulations required backcountry campers to use established sites, but I almost wished I could push on. Something about this place felt wrong, the water too still, the surrounding trees too watchful. As I set up camp, I discovered a crude figure hanging from a nearby branch, twigs bound together with what looked like animal sinew to form a humanoid shape. My first thought was vandalism, some teenager's idea of a Blair Witch reference, but the craftsmanship suggested something older, more purposeful. I left it untouched and focused on securing my camp before darkness fell. The pond's surface reflected the deepening sky, a perfect mirror until ripples suddenly spread across it. I hadn't seen anything break the surface. That night I built a larger fire than necessary, the flames offering both warmth and psychological comfort. The forest sounds seemed normal, frogs croaking near the pond, an occasional owl call, but underneath ran a current of wrongness I couldn't place. I was adding another log to the fire when I saw it, a shape at the forest's edge, tall and impossibly thin. For a moment I thought it was just another tree trunk. Then it moved. My body froze while my mind raced. The figure stood partially hidden behind a large pine, but I could make out a human-like silhouette. It remained perfectly still, watching. I reached slowly for my knife. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know you're there." No response, no movement, just patient, predatory stillness. I grabbed my flashlight and directed the beam toward the spot, but found only empty forest. Whatever I'd seen had vanished, or never been there at all. Yet the feeling of being observed intensified, pressing against me like a physical weight. Sleep was impossible. I kept the fire burning through the night, listening to the forest and trying to distinguish normal sounds from potential threats. Occasionally, branches would crack in the distance, always from a different direction, as if something was circling my camp. Shortly before dawn, I dozed off despite my intentions to remain alert. I awoke with a jolt to find my fire reduced to embers and something placed at the edge of my campsite, a freshly killed rabbit, its neck broken and body arranged with unnatural precision. The message was clear. While I slept, something had approached close enough to leave this offering. I abandoned any pretense of normal camping routine, hastily packing my essential gear and leaving the rest behind. My only thought was to reach the ranger station marked on my map, about 15 miles ahead. As I shouldered my lightened pack, movement caught my eye, something large passing between distant trees. The glimpse was too brief to identify, but the impression lingered. A figure walking upright but moving with animal fluidity, its outline somehow wrong against the morning light. I took one last look at my abandoned campsite and the grotesque gift left for me. Then I ran. The trail descended through stands of ancient hemlock, their massive trunks creating a labyrinth of shadows. I moved as quickly as safety allowed, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The heavy silence of the forest pressed against my ears. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures. Everything was holding its breath. According to my map, the trail should intersect with a fire road about 7 miles ahead. From there, I might encounter other hikers or forestry workers. The thought spurred me on despite my burning lungs and aching legs. Around noon, I paused beside a small stream to refill my water bottle. As I crouched at the water's edge, something caught my attention, a reflection in the clear surface that didn't match the surroundings. I jerked upright, scanning the opposite bank. Nothing visible, but the sense of being watched intensified. I abandoned the water and pushed on, the back of my neck prickling with awareness of unseen eyes. The forest gradually changed character, the old growth giving way to younger trees with dense undergrowth. The trail narrowed, forcing me to push through shoulder-high ferns that limited visibility to a few feet ahead. Each step became an act of faith, each turn revealing only more green tunnel. I was fighting through a particularly thick section when I found the first trap. A nearly invisible line of braided animal sinew stretched across the path at ankle height. Had I been moving at my earlier pace, I would have tripped directly into a bed of sharpened sticks, positioned to impale whatever fell upon them. My blood turned to ice water. This wasn't some forest predator or territorial animal. This was calculated human malevolence. I carefully stepped over the trap and continued with heightened caution, scanning the ground before each step. 2 more traps appeared in the next mile. One a pit disguised with a covering of branches and leaves, another a deadfall triggered by a tripwire. Who would set such things in a national forest? My mind recalled stories of hermits and isolationists who sometimes claimed wilderness territories as their own, attacking those they considered trespassers. But these traps felt different, not the work of someone trying to keep people away, but of someone herding me in a specific direction. By mid-afternoon, I realized I'd lost the official trail. The path I was following appeared well used but didn't match my map. Had I missed a turn, or had I been deliberately led astray? The canopy had thickened again, making it impossible to get my bearings from the sun. I came to a small clearing and stopped to check my GPS device. Dead. The battery had been nearly full that morning. My phone showed no signal, as expected, but its compass app still functioned. According to the digital needle, I was heading northwest, away from the ranger station. Anxiety threatened to overwhelm me. I forced myself to breathe deeply and think logically. The fire road should lie directly east. I would forge my own path if necessary. As I turned to leave the clearing, I spotted something that froze the breath in my lungs, a crude structure hidden among the trees at the far edge. At first glance, it resembled a hunting blind, but closer inspection revealed something more disturbing. The small shelter was constructed of interwoven branches and animal hides stretched over a frame of lashed-together saplings. Bones hung from the edges, small mammals and birds mostly, but some larger specimens I couldn't identify. The entrance gaped like a black mouth, revealing nothing of the interior. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming to run in the opposite direction. A nauseating smell emanated from the structure, the metallic scent of blood mixed with something musky and feral. Just outside the entrance lay a collection of items that stopped me cold. A broken compass, the shredded remains of a hiking boot, a twisted frame of what might once have been a backpack, trophies, or warnings, a sound behind me. The snap of a twig, deliberate and close. I spun around to face empty forest, then heard it again, from a different direction. My pursuer was toying with me. I backed away from the shelter, trying to maintain awareness in all directions. Another snap, closer still, then silence, more terrifying than any noise could be. The attack, when it came, was nearly silent. A rush of movement from my left, a dark shape hurtling through the undergrowth. I caught a glimpse of something wearing what looked like animal furs, moving with a terrible loping speed. I ran blindly, crashing through brush and branches, aware of pursuit behind me. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. As I scrambled to rise, I caught sight of my pursuer for the first time. The figure stood about 20 yards away, partially concealed by a tree trunk. Its form was human-shaped but wrong somehow, too angular, joints bending in unnatural ways. It wore what appeared to be a crudely stitched covering of animal pelts and a headdress that incorporated antlers or bones. The face remained in shadow, but I could feel its gaze with physical intensity. For several heartbeats, neither of us moved. Then it raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or threat. I didn't wait to find out which. I ran again, no longer caring about direction or stealth, driven by pure survival instinct. Branches whipped my face, thorns tore at my clothing. Behind me came sounds of pursuit, not directly behind, but paralleling my course, sometimes drawing closer, sometimes falling back. I realized with growing horror that I was being herded, driven in a specific direction by an intelligence that knew these woods intimately. Each time I tried to veer eastward, the sounds of pursuit intensified, forcing me back on a northerly course. The forest began to thin, and ahead I glimpsed what appeared to be the edge of a cliff or steep drop-off. The pursuing sounds converged from both sides now, leaving me only one direction, forward. I burst from the tree line onto a rocky ledge overlooking a river gorge, perhaps 100 feet below. The water looked distant and unreachable, white rapids threading between sharp rocks. I turned to face the forest, knife in hand, back to the precipice. The trees remained still and silent. Nothing emerged. After long minutes, I began to wonder if I'd imagined the pursuit entirely. As the adrenaline ebbed, rational thought returned. I checked my compass again. The gorge ran roughly east-west. If I could find a way down to the river, it might lead me to civilization. Rivers always do. I moved carefully along the ledge, searching for a descent route. As I did, something caught my eye on a rock near the cliff edge, fresh claw marks, deep and deliberate, forming a crude symbol I didn't recognize, a message or a claim, and the certainty that whatever hunted me was far from finished. The gorge stretched before me with no visible path down. I followed the ridgeline eastward as afternoon light began to fade, hoping to find a break in the cliff face. My pursuer remained hidden, but occasional sounds from the forest confirmed its continuing presence, patient, monitoring, waiting for darkness. After 2 miles of increasingly difficult terrain, I found what I was looking for. A steep but manageable descent, where a landslide had created a rough natural staircase to the river below. I began picking my way down, testing each foothold before committing my weight. The river roared louder as I descended, its voice drowning out any sounds of pursuit. This bothered me more than it should have, at least before I'd had some awareness of the creature's location. Now I felt blind, vulnerable. By the time I reached the river's edge, dusk was settling over the gorge. The water moved too swiftly for safe crossing, but a narrow game trail followed the bank heading downstream. I took it, moving as quickly as the fading light allowed. The walls of the gorge loomed on either side, cutting off the last daylight and plunging the river into premature night. I activated my flashlight, knowing it made me visible but having no choice if I wanted to avoid a fatal misstep. The trail occasionally vanished, forcing me to climb over boulder fields or wade through shallow sections of the river. My boots and pants became soaked, adding to my misery as temperature dropped with nightfall. Around what I estimated to be midnight, I came upon a natural alcove in the canyon wall, a shallow cave offering some shelter from the increasing wind. Exhaustion overwhelmed caution, and I decided to rest. The cave's narrow entrance would at least prevent anything from approaching unseen. I huddled against the back wall, facing the entrance with my knife and flashlight ready. Outside, the river's constant voice masked other sounds. The darkness beyond my small circle of light seemed absolute. Sleep came in fitful bursts, each awakening bringing momentary panic. During one such episode, I became aware of a change. The cave seemed darker. I raised my flashlight to find the entrance partially blocked by a crude arrangement of branches and rocks, clearly placed there while I'd slept. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't heard a thing over the river's noise. Whatever stalked me had approached close enough to begin sealing me in, and might still be just outside. I moved to the entrance and cautiously pushed aside the barricade. The night beyond appeared empty, but the absolute certainty of being watched settled over me like a physical weight. Sleep was no longer an option. I spent the remaining hours until dawn in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every shift of shadow or change in the river's voice. Sometime before morning, a scraping sound came from the roof of the cave, something moving across the rock above me. When first light finally came, I emerged cautiously to find fresh tracks in the mud near the entrance. Not quite human, not quite animal. The impressions were deep, as if made by something heavier than its size would suggest. They approached the cave directly, then circled around to the side where a path led up to the top of the alcove. I didn't wait to see what other signs morning might reveal. I continued downstream, moving faster now with improved visibility. The gorge gradually widened, the walls becoming less steep. By mid-morning, I found what looked like an old logging road intersecting the river at a shallow ford. The road was overgrown but still visible, heading east through thinning forest. Hope surged for the first time in days. I pushed on with renewed energy, following the dirt track as it wound through stands of younger trees and occasional clearings. Around noon, I found the first sign of human presence, an old fire ring with relatively recent ashes. Someone had camped here within the past week. I searched the site thoroughly, finding a discarded energy bar wrapper with part of a manufacturing date still visible. Recent. The road improved as I continued, showing occasional tire tracks and muddy sections. By late afternoon, I spotted a structure through the trees, an old fire lookout tower standing on a cleared hilltop. I approached cautiously, years of wilderness experience warring with desperate need for help. The tower appeared maintained but currently unmanned, its metal stairs leading up to a small cabin perhaps 40 feet above ground. The door at the base of the stairs was unlocked. A sign indicated the tower was open to hikers during daylight hours but not for overnight use. I ignored this directive and climbed quickly, wanting height and visibility more than anything else. The cabin at the top was small but well equipped. A desk with radio equipment, maps on the walls, basic emergency supplies. Most importantly, it offered 360-degree views of the surrounding forest. I tried the radio immediately, but received only static across all frequencies. A logbook on the desk showed the tower was checked weekly during fire season, with the last entry dated just 3 days ago. Help would come, if I could just hold out. As afternoon faded toward evening, I scanned the forest edge with obsessive regularity. For hours, nothing moved except wind-blown branches. Then, as sunset painted the western sky in bloody streaks, I spotted it, a figure emerging from the tree line directly below the tower. Through binoculars found in the cabin, I finally saw my pursuer clearly. The sight defied easy description. A human form, certainly, but moved with an unnatural, jerking gait. It wore a covering made from multiple animal hides stitched together, and a headdress incorporating a deer skull with antlers intact. Where its face should have been visible beneath this grotesque helmet, there was only shadow. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring up at the tower. Even from 40 feet above, I felt pinned by that invisible gaze. It raised one arm in that same ambiguous gesture I'd seen before, then deliberately walked the perimeter of the clearing, never taking its attention from the tower. I watched, transfixed, as it completed a full circuit, then returned to its starting point. There it began what I can only describe as a ritual, moving in patterns that seemed both random and precisely calculated, occasionally stopping to scrape marks in the earth or arrange small objects it carried. As darkness fell, I lost sight of the figure, but could hear activity continuing below, scraping sounds, the crack of breaking branches, something being dragged across the ground. I kept all lights off, not wanting to silhouette myself in the windows. Around midnight, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise, an expectant, predatory hush. I strained to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. The first impact against the tower's base came without warning, a heavy, deliberate thud that vibrated through the metal framework, then another, and another. Not random attacks, but rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat, testing the structure, or sending a message. The impacts continued for perhaps 20 minutes, then ceased. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, the distinctive creak of weight on the metal stairs. Step by step, methodical and unhurried, something was ascending toward the cabin. I braced a chair against the hatch that served as the cabin's only entrance, then retreated to the far side, knife in hand. The creaking progress continued until it reached the top. The hatch handle turned, found resistance, then stopped. Silence again, stretching interminably. Then a scraping directly against the outside wall of the cabin, something circling the small structure, testing each wall, each window. Occasionally, a shadow would pass across the glass, blocking the faint starlight. This psychological siege continued through the night. Periods of activity, followed by unnerving silence, then renewed attempts to find weakness in my refuge. I remained motionless, conserving energy, mind oscillating between terror and a strange, detached analysis of my situation. As pre-dawn light began to filter through the trees, the presence withdrew. I heard its descent on the metal stairs, then watched through binoculars as it crossed the clearing toward the forest edge. At the tree line, it turned for one final look at the tower. In daylight, what I saw made no logical sense. The figure's proportions seemed to shift as it moved, its silhouette changing subtly against the dark trees. It raised both arms in a gesture that might have been supplication or threat, then slipped into the forest and was gone. But it had left something behind. In the center of the clearing, visible now in growing daylight, was an arrangement that turned my blood to ice. My own discarded gear from the abandoned campsite, arranged in a crude human shape. A message, unmistakable in its intent. You are not escaping. The day passed in tense vigilance. I searched the tower thoroughly, looking for anything that might help my situation. The emergency supplies included water purification tablets, some preserved food, a first aid kit, and a flare gun with 3 rounds. The radio remained stubbornly silent, despite my repeated attempts across all frequencies. Most valuable was a detailed topographical map covering the entire region. I located the tower's position and traced potential routes to civilization. The nearest ranger station was approximately 18 miles east, but the terrain between looked challenging, a series of ridges and valleys with few established trails. More concerning was what I found in the tower's logbook. Between mundane entries about weather conditions and fire risk, I discovered a pattern, references to unusual activity and unexplained sightings, stretching back several seasons. The most recent entry, from just 3 days ago, included a cryptic note. Found more structures in North Quadrant. Reported to HQ. No response yet. As afternoon waned, I faced a difficult decision. The logbook indicated the next scheduled check wouldn't happen for 4 days. Could I last that long under siege? Or should I attempt to reach help on my own? The creature's behavior suggested it was playing a calculated game. It could have attacked directly many times, but chose psychological warfare instead. This realization didn't comfort me. Whatever hunted me was intelligent, patient, and intimately familiar with these woods. I decided to leave at first light. Remaining meant eventual dehydration or starvation if help didn't arrive. At least movement offered some chance, however slim. That night passed in similar fashion to the previous one. Intermittent testing of the tower's structure, occasional ascents of the staircase, and that same unnerving circling of the cabin. I didn't sleep, but conserved energy and planned my route for morning. Dawn came with unexpected fog, thick white mist that limited visibility to a few dozen yards. It wasn't ideal for navigation, but provided cover I desperately needed. I packed what supplies I could carry from the tower, including the flare gun, and descended cautiously, scanning constantly for movement in the surrounding whiteness. The clearing seemed abandoned, but the arrangement of my gear remained in the center, a grotesque scarecrow marking what felt increasingly like my own grave. I skirted it widely and headed east, compass in hand. The fog muffled sound and distorted distance, transforming the forest into an alien landscape. I moved as quietly as possible, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. For the first hour, I detected nothing unusual, just the drip of condensation from leaves and the occasional call of a bird. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing a landscape of steep ridges and narrow valleys. I maintained my eastward heading, sometimes having to detour around impassable terrain, but always returning to my chosen direction. Around noon, I found the first sign that I was being followed, a crude marker fashioned from twisted branches pointing in the direction I had just come from. It hadn't been there when I passed earlier. My pursuer was not only tracking me, but moving ahead to leave these taunting signs. I quickened my pace despite growing fatigue. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, loose shale slopes that threatened to send me sliding, thick understory that clutched at my legs, stream crossings where the water ran swift and cold. By late afternoon, I reached the base of a particularly steep ridge. According to my map, once over this obstacle, the land would gradually descend toward the ranger station. I began the climb, muscles protesting after days of constant exertion and minimal rest. Near the summit, I found another marker, this one more elaborate. A small collection of bones arranged in a spiral pattern, with a central space containing what looked disturbingly like a human molar. I forced myself not to think about its origin. The ridge top offered a momentary sense of achievement. Below stretched a valley that eventually opened onto what appeared to be logged areas, signs of human activity. Perhaps 3 or 4 hours of travel, if I maintained my pace. I had just started my descent when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in any natural forest. A rhythmic clicking, like bone striking bone, emanating from the ridgeline behind me. I didn't turn to look. I ran. The downslope was treacherous, loose rocks and exposed roots threatening to send me tumbling. I abandoned caution for speed, using trees to break my descent where possible. The clicking sound continued, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, but always present. At the valley floor, I encountered a small stream and followed it eastward. The banks were overgrown but provided clear direction. As twilight approached, I faced the reality that I wouldn't reach civilization before dark. I needed shelter, somewhere defensible to wait out the night. The stream had carved a small ravine in places, with undercut banks and exposed root systems of large trees. One such hollow looked promising, a cavity beneath a massive old-growth evergreen, partially screened by fallen branches. I crawled inside and arranged the branches to better conceal the entrance. The space was cramped but offered good visibility of the approaching streambed while hiding me from casual observation. Darkness fell with the suddenness particular to forests. I didn't dare use my flashlight, instead relying on increasingly dilated pupils to make out shapes in the gloom. The stream's gentle voice provided some cover for small movements, but also masked sounds of approach. I don't know exactly when I became aware of the presence. There was no sound, no visual cue, just an absolute certainty that something waited nearby. I controlled my breathing, trying not to make the slightest noise while straining to detect movement in the darkness. A soft scraping sound came from directly above, something moving across the top of my shelter. Dirt and small debris filtered down through the roots forming my ceiling. The weight moved methodically, testing different sections of the ground above. I clutched the flare gun, considering my options. Firing would reveal my position absolutely, but might drive the creature away temporarily. Or it might provoke a direct attack. I decided to wait. Hours passed in this suspended state, the presence above occasionally shifting position but never leaving. Once, a small object dropped through the roots and landed beside me, a carved wooden figure, humanoid but with exaggerated limbs and an animal-like head. A calling card, left deliberately. Shortly before dawn, the heaviness above receded. I remained motionless, suspecting a trap. When faint light finally began filtering through the trees, I cautiously emerged, every sense alert for danger. The streambed appeared empty in both directions. On the ground above my shelter, I found disturbed earth and a clear impression, as if something heavy had lain there through the night, watching, waiting, perhaps listening to my terrified heartbeat just inches below. I resumed my eastward journey immediately, following the stream as it widened and joined a larger waterway. The forest began showing signs of human management. Younger stands of trees in regular patterns, occasional cut stumps, and finally a narrow dirt road paralleling the water. Hope surged. I increased my pace despite exhaustion. The road gradually improved, showing tire tracks and eventually widening enough for vehicle passage. By mid-morning I spotted what looked like a building through the trees ahead. I approached cautiously, having learned harsh lessons about false security. It was an old logging shed or equipment storage, abandoned but relatively intact. No vehicle was present, but boot prints in the mud suggested recent human visitation. Inside, I found basic tools, some empty fuel containers, and, most precious, a two-way radio on a shelf. I activated it with trembling hands and was rewarded with the crackle of static. I cycled through channels until I found one with audible voices, then pressed the transmit button. Emergency. Hiker in distress. Located at old logging shed east of Black Ridge Valley. Being pursued. Need immediate assistance. The response was immediate but broken, signal fading in and out. Copy that. Location again. Sending. Stay put. Relief nearly overwhelmed me. Help was coming. I just needed to hold out. I secured the shed as best I could, using tools to reinforce the single door and small window. Then I took up position where I could watch the approach from the forest while maintaining access to the radio. As afternoon stretched toward evening, a new sound reached me, the distant but unmistakable drone of a vehicle engine. I almost wept with relief. But as the sound grew closer, another awareness dawned. A presence in the forest edge opposite the road. A figure partially concealed by shadows, watching the shed with unnerving stillness. The antlered silhouette was unmistakable. We both heard the approaching vehicle. The figure made no move to retreat, instead stepping partially into clearer view. For the first time, I witnessed a display that seemed like genuine emotion, a posture of rage or defiance directed not at me, but at the approaching intrusion. The creature turned its antlered head toward me one final time. Even without seeing its face, I understood the message. This isn't over. Then it was gone, melting into the forest with unnatural speed just as headlights appeared on the access road. The Forestry Service truck pulled up outside the shed, and two uniformed rangers emerged, looking concerned and confused. I stumbled outside, babbling my story in disconnected fragments. They exchanged glances I couldn't interpret, then helped me into their vehicle. As we drove away, I kept my eyes fixed on the darkening forest edge, certain that somewhere in those shadows, patient yellow eyes were watching, waiting. The threat had retreated, but not disappeared. And deep down, I knew with terrible certainty that the wilderness held secrets most of us are never meant to uncover. Territories where the line between predator and prey, between human and other, blurs into meaninglessness. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some watchers aren't meant to be seen. The rangers took me to a small outpost where I gave a formal statement. Their reactions ranged from professional concern to poorly concealed skepticism. They documented my injuries, the condition of my equipment, and took detailed notes about my encounter locations. One of them, an older man with weathered features, asked fewer questions but watched me with unsettling intensity. When I finished my account, the younger ranger left to make some calls. The older one, Ranger Blackburn according to his nameplate, remained behind. "Not the first report we've had," he said quietly once we were alone. "Not even the 10th. I stared at him, processing the implications. Official position is cougar activity, maybe bears, territorial behaviors misinterpreted by exhausted hikers. He shrugged. Paperwork's easier that way. "But you don't believe that," I said. He studied me for a long moment. 26 years in these forests. Seen things that don't fit neat explanations. Tracks that change character mid-stride. Structures no local would build. Hunters gone missing where they shouldn't. Why don't you warn people? About what exactly? Warn them that the most remote sections of wilderness might contain something that doesn't appear in any wildlife manual? He shook his head. Tourism board would love that. The conversation ended when the younger ranger returned. I was transported to the nearest hospital for treatment of dehydration, exposure, and various minor injuries. The doctors were professional but distant, clearly attributing my psychological state to trauma and exhaustion. I was released after 2 days and gave additional statements to local police and Forest Service officials. My account was recorded, filed, and effectively buried. The official report cited an unfortunate combination of poor preparation, navigation errors, and wildlife encounters. I returned home to concerned friends and a backlog of work emails. Superficially, life resumed its normal rhythm. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Sleep became my enemy. Each night brought dreams of being pursued through endless forests by a patient, calculating presence. I would wake gasping, certain something was watching from the darkened corners of my bedroom. Rational thought provided no defense against these visceral reactions. I researched obsessively, spending hours scouring internet forums and obscure anthropological journals. Reports existed, scattered, often ridiculed, but showing disturbing consistencies, encounters in remote areas with figures described as wearing animal hides and antlers or horns, unexplained structures deep in wilderness areas, patterns of stalking behavior lasting days. Most accounts ended with the person escaping to civilization. A few ended differently, discovered only as brief mentions in missing persons databases or local newspaper archives. 3 weeks after my return, a small package arrived at my apartment. No return address, postmarked from the small town nearest to Black Ridge Forest. Inside was a folded note and a small wooden carving, identical to the one dropped into my shelter that final night. The note, written in cramped handwriting, contained just 3 lines. Boundary crossed. Recognition established. It remembers your scent. It knows where you live. I moved the following week, changing my name and leaving no forwarding address. I abandoned social media and cut ties with anyone connected to my previous life. Some might call it paranoia. I consider it survival. I live now in a small apartment in a crowded city, as far from wilderness as I can manage. Yet sometimes, catching a glimpse of parkland trees from my window, I feel that familiar prickle between my shoulder blades, the certainty of being observed by patient, calculating eyes. Most disturbing are the small signs, arranged twigs on my windowsill, unaccountable scratching at my door in the dead of night, the occasional glimpse of an antlered silhouette reflected in windows of buildings across the street. Boundaries mean nothing to it. Distance is merely an inconvenience. Civilization offers the illusion of protection, nothing more. I write this account not as warning. Those who need warning won't recognize the danger until too late, but as testimony. Something ancient and other shares our world, dwelling in the diminishing spaces between human territories. It watches from forest shadows, learning our patterns, testing our defenses. And sometimes when it finds a human who strays too far into its domain, it follows them home. Listen carefully tonight. That sound, branches against your window, or fingers. That shadow, just clothes hanging in your closet, or something watching, waiting. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some watchers aren't meant to be seen. And some pursuits never truly end.